What's going on, guys? It's your boy Pt3 back at it again with another banger of a video. And today we are going to be finishing off the series for the Burrow limited card review for draft and sealed. And today we are going to be taking down the rares and mythics of each respective color. And as well, I did happen to forget about like the lands and the artifacts in the previous portions of this video. And if you haven't seen the common and uncommon reviews, those are already available on the YouTube channel. So make sure to go check those out if you have already not done so. As always, the grading scale is from A, B, C, D, and F. A being bombs, cards that are good in all situations, cards you are very excited to be first picking. B's are cards that you would also like to first pick, but a card that is pulling me into a specific lane, something that is making me want to go into a specific archetype. For example, red-white, a very aggressive red-white-gold card might make me want to go down that avenue because of the benefits that it provides. C's are cards that are going to be making up most of your draft decks, which are cards that are good cards, but specifically role players in typically 1 to 2 archetypes, and their ceiling is often fulfilled by you already being in that archetype. These cards may not be powerful enough to where they're making you want to go to that archetype, but if you were already there, then they will do very well. D's are cards that you would prefer not to play, but sometimes you end up having to play a few lower quality cards. These are kind of just more niche versions of the C grade cards that honestly just aren't that great, aren't that impactful, but if you are in the correct archetype, they still can be beneficial to your drafting experience. And F's are cards that are typically created for constructed or commander play in mind, and as well some cards I will shout out as a good card to have within the sideboard for my best 2 out of 3 players, but typically cards that may not be worth main decking in the format. Now this is going to take a very long time, so I don't know if I'll be able to get through all of this today, but I'm going to try my best, and for that reason I'm going to be trying to go very quickly. So if I'm going too fast, you might have to slow down the video. But either way, we're going to get a lot of good knowledge done today and hopefully prepare you for the release of Burrow, which I believe becomes available on Tuesday the 30th. So very, very excited for this format. I think everyone can agree this is probably one of the sets with the most hype artwork in many years, in many of the past years. And I think that's got a big pull in getting people in excitement for this set, but we don't know yet how fun it is going to be. Personally, for me, I'm just a big advocate of 3 color sets in general because I feel like they require a more difficult job of fulfilling the puzzle of finding out where you should be within the draft. But this is going to be a 2-color set, so hopefully I'll be able to get through it. Hopefully there are some fun things to find out that are not already just laid out to us by the development team, things that we can discover. Those are really the most enjoyment I get from limited sets, but that is going to lead us in to the review for our rares and mythics, and we're going to be starting off with the color white. So without further ado, let's get into the goo. One moment. Technical difficulties. All right, here we are with our first card. Starting off in white, this is going to be Caretaker's Talent. This is 2 and a white for an enchantment class, with level 1 being whenever one or more tokens you control enter, draw a card, and this only triggers once each turn. Level 2, for the cost of 1 white, says when this becomes level 2, create a token that is a copy of target token you control. And then level 3, you can pay 3 and a white for creatures, tokens you control, get +2/+2. Okay, let me really break this down. I'm going to try to be as specific as possible for my people who are just listening to this or who will go back and re-listen to this video but will not be watching visually. So you're paying 3 mana for an enchantment, and then whenever a token enters, you get to draw a card once per turn. Now, this can trigger during either player's turn. And then at level 2, you get to create a token that is a copy of a token you control. And then level 3, you're getting +2/+2. So this card seems like a considerable cost to you building around this for there actually to be justifiable benefits for you to put this in your deck. Now, I think this is a powerful card, especially just like with the late game value engine potential, but it seems like this is specifically made for the green-white deck where you are really caring about tokens, because outside of the offspring mechanic, which is really only on a few cards in each color, the green-white deck is the main deck where you're going to be able to consistently say, I will create enough tokens to make this valuable. Now, if you are in that deck, this is probably a pretty good card. I'm going to go ahead and give this a build around B-, maybe even a C+, because you do have to do some work for this. And I will say that the green-white deck is relatively aggressive, and that might knock this down a peg just because taking a turn off to get this into play might kind of go against your game plan of trying to curve out and use all of your mana each turn, because it doesn't really give you immediate board presence, nor does it immediately advance your game state, which is something that I feel like is pretty important in the green-white deck. So I'm going to go with C+ for now, but it very easily could be a B- card. Definitely just a very segmented one. All right, next card is Dawn's Truce. This is 1 and a white instant. You and your permanents gain hexproof until the end of the turn, and if you gift your opponent a card, permanents you control also gain indestructible. So an AoE hexproof seems pretty valuable in the green-white tokens deck, and as well within the red-white mice deck, because although you aren't triggering Valiant with this, you are building a wide board, which seems relatively important. And if your opponent is tapping out all of their mana to be able to AoE that said board, I think that this is justifiably worth it to give your opponent a card. But I do think that there are going to be some situations where if you're already ahead and your opponent doesn't have access to an AoE, because typically those are more premium, and through the uncommon and common review, we really didn't get to see that many AoEs, if any at all. I think there was just that red one that dealt 2 to everyone, to the best of my knowledge, but I could be wrong. I'd have to go back and look at it again. So I feel like this is a powerful card. I don't know how relevant it would be based on the available AoEs, but it is a fair price. And I think this is probably just going to be a C+ card. You know, it's kind of a card where it's like, kind of win more in terms of the draft. This isn't pulling me into one of those archetypes. If I already have a really premium deck, and I have cards that are going to allow me to easily, consistently advance my game state and establish a board presence, then this is probably a nice, like, reward to have. So that's why I couldn't see this being any better than a C+. So we're just going to go with that. All right, moving on to our next card here. We have Essence Channeler. This is 1 and a white for a 2/1 Bat Cleric. As long as you have lost life this turn, this has flying and vigilance. When you gain life, put a 1/1 counter on this creature, and whenever this dies, put its counters on target creature you control. Wow. Well, this card seems really good. So, as long as you've lost life, you get flying and vigilance. I guess I kind of misread that the first read. I thought that this card immediately had flying. So it actually has conditional flying. I like the benefits of this card, but knowing that you don't get immediate flying makes me feel like you have to be trying to lose life. You have to do something to be losing life or gaining life to put 1/1 counters on this. So I feel like the only deck that's interested in this is the Bat deck. Because if you're not reliably interacting with either of these abilities, or your deck is not trying to, I feel like it's just kind of like a borderline playable card. And one you would probably prefer not to be playing. Plus, I think there are just some inherent benefits of putting this within a deck to where moving the counters over to another creature might actually benefit you. So I feel like in the Bat deck, it's probably a build around B because it is relatively low opportunity cost. And you don't have to do a lot of work to make this like worth way more than what you actually paid for. So I'm going to go with the build around B because I don't think anybody else is really interested in this, but it is a very cool card. It seems like a very pushed card within the Bat deck, but I don't know how good that deck is yet. Next up, we have Jackdaw Savior. This is 2 and a white for a 3/1 bird flying. When this or another creature you control with flying dies, return another creature card with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. Wow, that is really good. So it's 3 mana for a 3/1 flying, which honestly is not bad by any means. And then when this dies or another creature with flying dies, you get to revive something from the graveyard with a lesser mana value. And I think the big point to be looking at here is that this card does not put a finality counter on the card you're reviving. So potentially you can just keep this infinite value engine loop going to some extent, as long as you can put, higher costed flyers on the board and let them die to bring back the lower cost ones. Those can even go lower. And then the card that you revive doesn't even have to have flying. It's only the card that dies that has to have flying. Which makes me think maybe this card is still probably pretty good outside of the bird space. Because even if you're in the red-white space, being able to revive a premium 2-drop while you trade this with a game piece seems pretty good for the amount of mana that you're paying and the amount of pressure that you're applying. So to me, this seems like probably a B, just because it can be used in pretty much any aggressive white deck, maybe even some controlling white decks, and you don't really have to do much work. There are obviously ways to increase the ceiling of this higher if you have a bunch of flyers, but even if this is just dying, that's still just a good exchange of value for what you're paying for, which makes me think this is a really strong card to start out with. So we're just going to go with the B across the board. All right, our next card is Salvation Swan. This is 3 and a white for a 3/3 bird flash flying. Whenever this or another bird you control enters, exile up to 1 target creature you control without flying, then return it to the battlefield with a flying counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. That seems really pushed. So at first glance, I feel like the flash on this card honestly is not needed to make this card good. So the fact that this card does have flash makes this card even more premium. So let's say I don't have very many synergies with this. Let's just say I'm playing the red-white deck. I can flash this in, and then I could potentially trigger one of my Valiant triggers that doesn't only affect that card, then bring it back with a flying counter in response to their removal on my card, and then I'm just going +1, and then I'm floating a 3/3 flyer with the potential of additional upside by playing more flyers later on. I honestly really wish this was a blue card because I feel like the green-blue deck would be most interested in this. And so I feel like there are some innate justifications for you to be potentially splashing this within the green-blue space, especially because it seems like the green deck out of any color has the most relatively easily accessible fixing, where you could potentially splash a bomb rare mythic, and I think this definitely meets those qualifications. I do think that if you put this in the wrong deck, though, it's not going to be as good. Like, if you don't have benefits to triggering an ETB or triggering Valiant, it's probably not as beneficial to you. But I do think that, like, the floor of this card is just so high. So I'm going to go with B+, because I just think a lot of different decks will find utility with this, and some of those decks being the Birds deck or the red-white mice deck will be able to get the ceiling on this card even higher, which makes me think this is a B+ card, and it is a card that I'm very happy to be taking pack 1, pick 1, just because you can really only have such few interactions with this card. Like, ETBs are just on everything nowadays. And once again, the flash was unnecessary, Wizards. Next up, we have Starfall Invocation. This is 3 white, destroy all creatures, and if you promise your opponent a card, you can return a creature card put into your graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. That seems really good. So this is a bomb AoE, which then I can exchange my opponent 1 card to bring back one of my bombs. And the more creatures that you are removing from your opponent's battlefield with this, the more happy you are to be giving them a card, because then it is less of a cost, which I think is honestly really unfair about this card, because it almost feels like you're only going to have this in a control deck. So obviously, when you're using this, it's going to be impactful, I would assume, right? Because, like, you're going to be not developing the board as quickly as someone who's playing an aggro deck. They're losing a bunch of resources. So even without bringing back your creature, it's already pretty unfair, considering how limited the AoEs are in this format and how limited the protection to those AoEs are. Like, we really saw the first protection to an AoE effect at rarity, which tells me that this card is very premium. And we've just seen, like, a high success rate with cards that have, like, a similar effect to this and a similar impact on the game, which tells me that this is probably a B+ level card, because any white control deck is looking to play this, and the better that your deck is, the better that your creature quality is, the more powerful this effect can be. And I especially think this effect is going to be very strong in this format, because at first glance, it seems like overall, most decks are more aggressively slanted than control, and as well, those are probably some of the better decks. Like, the green-white and the green-red deck are probably going to be 2 of the best decks in the format, if not the top 2 decks, and white is just overall, at face value, the strongest color. So I think this is just a B+ card. Next up, we have Valley Quest Caller. This is 1 and a white for a 2/3 rabbit warrior. When 1 or more rabbits, bats, birds, and or mice enter, scry 1. Other rabbits, bats, mice, and birds you control get +1/+1. Okay, so this is a lord for pretty much every single type within white, which means this can only be so bad. I honestly would have liked to see this just be a 2/2, because it's providing such a high impact, or even just costing 3. Like, this is extremely underpriced for what you're getting with the Lord effect, considering how versatile it is, on top of the first effect, where you're just getting additional add-ons from the scry for anytime anything enters. That is really strong, and this goes in so many different decks. I think it goes without saying this is at minimum a B plus, maybe even an A minus, because the impact you're getting is very high, and this can only be so bad because those typings that this card covers are essentially all of the prevalent creature types within the white space. So I think this card is absurd. I'm honestly just going to go ahead and hedge my bets and say this is an A minus. All right, our next card is going to be Whisker Veil Forerunner. This is 3 and a white for a 3/4 mouse bard with a textbook worth of card text on it for no apparent reason. So this has Valiant, and that means the first time that it is targeted, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library, reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less, put it onto the battlefield if it's your turn. If you don't put it onto the battlefield, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. Wait, this card's broken. Wow. Okay, I think there's not really a lot to be said about this. Number one, they did a terrible job of putting so much text on this for something that I feel like could have been more easily simplified. Like, I would almost rather have this card, since it already has so much text, just not explain to you what Valiant is, because I think it just makes it more confusing when they keep putting the Valiant text, then immediately after the effect that the card provides, because I feel it's kind of misinforming new players, because you might think that this ability to look at 5 and play a 3 cost is just what Valiant does. And I think there's just a better way to do that. But regardless, I'm paying 4 mana for a 3/4. That is not terrible by any means. It is also a mouse, which is arguably, in my opinion, the best creature type in the format, because I think red-white just has the most powerful cards overall. And then every turn, when you target this, you get to put a creature with mana value 3 or less from the top 5 of your deck onto the battlefield. And if it's your opponent's turn, you just get to add it to your hand. I think this effect is even more broken than it sounds, specifically in this set, because pretty much all of the premium, just all the good white cards, all the good mice cards in general are 3 cost or less. So if you build a good mice deck, I feel like it's going to be like a 70 to 80% chance that you are going to hit something. Now, regardless of whether you get to put that on the battlefield or not, if you just do this one time, then that is absurd. But if you get to put it on the battlefield, that's even more win more. And I think you really can't go wrong with this card. I think this is probably an A minus. Just everything that you're getting, this is an infinite value engine that really has no cost. There is a cost of targeting it, but when you put that in perspective of this card is intended for the mice deck, and you think that that's something that the deck is already trying to do, you don't have to go out of your way to trigger this. It makes this card even more unfair. But this card, you could just play it in any other white deck as long as you have an appropriate curve. So that's why I think this is just an A minus, A level card, because it can go in multiple decks, and it can really only be so bad. All right, that's going to round it off for our rares within white. We are now going to move on to the white mythics, and our first card is Beza, the Bounding Spring. This is 2 and double white for a 4/5 legendary creature. Elemental elk typing is irrelevant. When this enters, create a treasure token if an opponent has more lands than you. You gain 4 life if an opponent has more life than you. Create 2/1/1 fish tokens if an opponent controls more creatures. Draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you. So I think this is kind of like an interesting card. I think this is definitely intended to be more for commander play than anything. But they did a good job of not making this card just completely only usable for a commander. Because I feel like most of the time, if you're playing this in a control deck, which is probably the most appropriate like place for this card, the two most likely options to occur are that your opponent is going to have more life because they are the aggressor. So gaining back 4 life and getting a 4/5 body attached to it is probably good if you're going against aggro. And then they'll probably have more creatures than you. So creating the 1/1 fish are actually really relevant because those do not come into play tapped, unlike the gift mechanic, which I think is very relevant for allowing you to stabilize. And then drawing a card, if you're the control player and your opponent has more creatures on the board than you, I think the draw and the opponent having more creatures, it's very unlikely that both of those things are going to occur at the same time. Because if they have more cards on the board than you, typically the other player has more cards in hand. Maybe it's a simplified game state and you just get every effect and it puts you back in the game. But it's most likely going to be best fitted in a control deck where you're consistently gaining 4 life and getting 2/1/1 tokens as chump blockers. And in that circumstance, I think it's pretty good. I think the floor is decently high on this card. I mean, 4 mana 4/5 isn't terrible. If you get at least one of these effects, it's probably going to have a decent impact on the game. But it's very likely that the first 2 effects often occur if you put it within the right deck. So I think I'm probably going to give this a B-, but specifically for the control decks. I think the aggro decks just aren't really interested in this. You definitely could put it in there, but if you put it in an aggro deck, it's more fishy that you're actually going to get more than one effect off. So I would assume in those decks, it's probably just going to be a C as a curve topper because it really can't be that bad. But overall, a very interesting design, and I like that it is not just exclusive to Commander. All right, moving on, we have Season of the Burrow. This is 3 and 2 white for a sorcery, and you may choose up to 5 paws worth of modes. Paws are a new resource, which it's just like a modular thing. It's like, imagine if you played a card and it presented you with energy, and you could pay that energy to choose multiple modes, but only that energy created by the card, like not your other sources of energy. That's like the best way to put it. You can choose the same mode more than once. So for 1 paw, you can create a 1/1 rabbit, and then for 2, you can exile a target non-land permanent and that player draws a card. And then for 3, you can return a permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it. Okay, I'm not gonna lie. Why do you get an indestructible counter? That's honestly really obnoxious. So I feel like with this card, the most likely options to occur are you reviving back a powerful 2 or 3 costed card in your aggressively slanted red, white, or green, white deck, and then you're going to get 2 1/1 rabbits, which bringing back something that is going to provide a decent effect on the board and just be like a permanent blocker because it will have indestructible, or just a permanent attacker, like whatever way you look at it. That is just a really good amount of value, especially within the green-white space, where creating any amount of tokens drastically is advancing your game state. And then the second option is just kind of like, okay, if they have a bomb, like maybe I want to exchange that for a card. So the added optionality makes the card even better. But I do think you're really only wanting to play this in those 2 aggressive white archetypes. If you play in a different white archetype, like let's say you play it in bats or birds, it's probably just like a C to C+. But I think within those aggressive decks, this is a really nice curve topper. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is up to a B if you have like powerful cards to bring back. Like, for example, if you have the green-white gold card, which is 1 green, 1 white for a 1/1, where its stats are equal to the number of creatures you control, and then it has trample, that's really powerful to bring back because you're going to get 2 rabbits, so it's going to be 3/3. And then it's going to be indestructible with trample. So you can just keep attacking every turn, which seems disgusting. So I'm going to go with saying this is probably a B within the green-white space, probably a B- to a B within the red-white space, and probably just a C+ for the other white decks. But overall, a strong card that I think you would be decently happy starting with in Pack 1, Pick 1. All right, our next card is Warren Warleader. This is 2 and double white for a 4/4 Rabbit Knight with Offspring 2 to create a 1/1 copy of it. And whenever you attack, you can choose to create a 1/1 Rabbit token that is also tapped and attacking, or attacking creatures get +1/+1 until end of turn. I think this card is really good. So this card is obviously best put in the green-white deck, but once again, I think there's a high overlap between the white cards being put within the rabbit space and as well the mice space of red-white, which I think those two decks are just looking very, very strong. So I think this is probably an A-. Like, I don't think you need to pay for the Offspring cost for this to just be like an insane value engine. But being able to create the Offspring token puts you even further ahead. And it's the fact that you don't have to specifically attack with this to trigger these effects that makes this very strong. Because if you attack with something and let's say best possible scenario, we pay for the Offspring, we now have 2 copies of this card. We attack with another creature into our opponent's board, which we know they're just going to kill our creature and chum block it. Well, if you're getting 2 1/1 rabbit tokens and they don't have enough blockers to block those, you're going to at least have 1 game piece left in that scenario to be able to keep repeating this value generation, which makes this card a really insane bomb because it fuels itself to be able to continuously generate value. And it's just good with or without the Offspring. The Offspring just provides you more insurance, stating that if they're able to remove one of these game pieces that provides this value generation, you at least have another one that does the same thing, kind of like making the removal spells kind of mediocre, which is kind of unfair because cards that typically provide an answer or like a difficulty for your opponent to respond efficiently into them and provide high impact typically overperform just in all formats in general, which tells me that this is probably an A- card within those archetypes. And then it's probably just like a B level card within like the bat or the bird space, those 2 decks. But overall, this card just seems absurd. All right, and then we have one final card for white from the bonus sheet. It is a reprint of Swords to Plowshares. If you don't know what this is, it's an instant. Exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. I mean, this is just a good card. I'm going to give this a B. Just because I think in some of the more aggressive decks, you really would prefer not to be giving your opponent life. But at a discount of 1 mana, it's just good in general. So probably just like a B level card across the board, but definitely going to be more powerful within the control spaces. And you're not going to see this often because it is from the bonus sheet. All right, moving on to blue, our first rare here is Azure Beastbinder. This is 1 in a blue for a 1/3 rat rogue with vigilance. This cannot be blocked by creatures with 2 power or greater. And whenever this attacks, up to 1 target artifact, creature, or planeswalker an opponent controls loses all abilities until your next turn. If it's a creature, it also has base power and toughness 2/2 until your next turn. So this is a very interesting card. So rats are blue-black, and they're the archetype that is trying to do the most with the graveyard. And this on its own doesn't really interact with the graveyard in any way, which means that it's not specifically like advancing your game state in the regard of what the win condition of that archetype is, but it is decently relevant. I think this is more of just like a good aggressive card. Not being able to be blocked by people with 2 or greater means that this is probably never dying in combat since it has 3 toughness, and it does have vigilance. So every turn you're clocking your opponent for 1, and then if they have like a powerful artifact, or if they just have the 1 planeswalker, the Raw, then that you can turn that off, I guess, or you can just make a big guy into a 2/2. So it's probably a card that you're never cutting, but also I don't think it's necessarily trying to do what the archetype it was intended for is trying to do. And so therefore, I don't think it's that high impact, but it is okay. Like, it's not bad for sure, right? I think this is probably just like a C+ card. Like, if you're already within the archetype that is playing this, and maybe you get like a synergy from controlling a rat, it probably becomes a little bit better. But I think it's fair just to give this a C+ because it's not bad, but it doesn't provide that much of an impact on the board. Next up, we have Dowerport Mage. This is 1 in a blue for a 1/3 frog, and whenever 1 or more other creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, draw a card. And for 1 in a blue, you can tap this and return another target creature you control to your hand. So this card is absolutely amazing. This card is a value engine that provides an inherent way to be able to generate that value, which is always just good. And then a 1/3 stat line for 2 is very, very efficient. So I think this card is probably just a B+ card. It's most beneficial within the green-blue space. I think other decks might be interested in it, but not as much as the deck that can already like inherently enable this effect without having to tap this card and pay the 2 mana. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a B+, because it's really good in the green-blue deck, and other decks, it's like, it could be good. It's not bad. Like, you can just keep drawing cards, but then you're going to have to pay, like, you know, continuous mana to do that, which in some of the other decks, I don't know that you'll always want to be doing. Like, for example, the red-blue spells deck, that deck prefers to have less creature-centric, you know, builds in general. So you're probably not going to be generating card advantage as quickly or as efficiently as the green-blue deck, but it's not like a bad card in that space. So I'm going to say this is a B+ within the green-blue space, and probably just like a B- in every other deck. Our next card is Kidnap. This is 2 and double blue for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. When this enters, tap enchanted creature, and then you may gift a card. If the gift was not promised, you can put 3 stun counters on it. Not you can, you have to put 3 stun counters on it. Oh, and then also you control enchanted creature. Wow. That is insane. So for 4 mana, I can potentially permanently control your creature by giving you a card, or I can control your creature and then put 3 stun counters on it, which in some situations might just strictly be better, because if you're in a best 2 out of 3 game and you already have prior knowledge that the opponent has access to enchantment removal, that means at worst, they're going to spend a removal on this card, and then you've traded 1 for 1, and you've put 3 stun counters on your opponent's creature. So actually, this is one of the first instances that I've actually liked the way that they made the gift mechanic for 1v1 scenarios, because it's not actually just like, okay, gifting a card is just always better, and you're just forced to pay that cost to do the thing. There's actually some situations where not gifting the card is better. So I think this card is actually really nice. And I think this card is probably best put within the green-blue space. Maybe the blue-red space might just be strictly better. I think both those decks are the ones that are most interested Other decks are probably decently interested in it, but you know, those decks are kind of higher costed in general, trying to play more of a late game oriented strategy, which kind of aligns more with the play pattern of this card. So I think in those decks, it's probably a B level card and maybe a B minus within the more aggressively slanted blue variants. Overall, a very cool design. Probably the first gift mechanic card I've actually been fairly impressed with. Like, it's actually fairly balanced. All right, our next card is Mockingbird. This is 1 blue and X for a flying with 1/1 bird, and you may have this enter as a copy of any creature on the battlefield with a mana value equal or less than the amount of mana that was spent to cast this, except it is a bird in addition to other types and has flying. That's pretty cool. So at worst, this is a 1 mana 1/1 flying, which honestly isn't even bad, especially if you're trying to play an aggressively slanted game plan. And then at best, you're getting to have an optionality of copying someone's creature based on the amount of mana, which I think is probably just better than like a 4-costed card that just copies whatever and doesn't have X, because the modularity might allow you to get like a better bargain for your buck. So I actually really like this card, but I do think it can be kind of narrow in its implications, because you do need to already either have a game piece or your opponent has to have something that's better than you, which is kind of interesting because this is probably best put within a control deck. And if your opponent has more creatures than you and you don't have a better creature than them, making a creature that is of equivalent stats and just has the flying tag probably won't help you if you're behind. So I do think this card looks better than it will actually play. So I'm going to give this a C+, but I do think it could be better depending on like what the matchup is and what kind of deck you're playing. All right, our next card is Portent of Calamity. This is blue and X for a sorcery. Reveal the top X cards of your library. For each card type, you may exile a card of that type from among them. Put the rest into the graveyard. You may cast a spell from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. If you exiled 4 or more cards this way, then put the rest of the cards into your hand. I won my pre-release with a Gruul deck that ramped turn 2 and just knew earlier 4-drop, 5-drop and hit face. I agree with that statement. It seems like most of the good decks are decks that are wanting to be aggressively slanted. Okay, so this card is honestly very interesting. At first glance, I feel like this card is better situated for constructed, but you do get to put the cards into the graveyard, which I do think is very relevant to the blue-black threshold deck. That's probably the best place to be playing this card. Saying that you're going to exile 4 cards and then cast one is really difficult to tell me, because at that point, then you're going to need a land, a artifact, a creature. Like, you're going to need to have all 5 be different types, most likely, to get the benefit of this. So I think more often than not, this is going to be like a late game mana sink for the threshold decks just to mill cards, which could be what you want to do if you already have enough payoffs for threshold and your opponent isn't expecting that you're just going to be able to put 6 cards into the graveyard. So I think this is probably just a C-level card. It's very narrow in the opportunity to potentially reach the ceiling, But I do think that, like, depending on how your deck is situated, you might actually just want to mill 5 or 6 cards, which might just be worth going neg 1 if it's just enabling a bunch of your other powerful game pieces. But I'm not sure that's going to occur as frequently as it may seem. So this is probably a C to a C minus, and you're probably going to be able to get this later than a lot of other cards because it's very narrow in its play window. And even if you're playing a threshold deck, your deck may not be correctly situated to take full advantage of this card. Our next card is Storm Chaser's Talent. This is 1 blue for an enchantment class. At level 1, when this enters, create a 1/1 blue and red otter with prowess. At level 2, for a cost of 3 and a blue, when this becomes level 2, return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. And at level 3, for 5 and a blue, when you cast an instant or sorcery, create a 1/1 blue-red otter creature token with prowess. So for 1 mana, you immediately get a 1/1 with prowess, and then at 4, you can return an instant or sorcery to your hand. And then level 3, I think, is very finicky. If you are able to take off a turn by not, like, advancing your game state and paying 6 mana, you're either just in a simplified game state or you're in a control matchup, and both players might just also be playing red-blue and their decks are very reactive, which tells me that the level 3 is very unlikely to be the best thing you should be doing with your mana, no matter what your deck is. So I think this card's okay. I'm going to go ahead and give this a C+, because notably, it's only beneficial to the red-blue deck. And secondly, this card, like classes in general, there's just a weird opportunity cost, a weird play window of when to actually use this. What's good about this versus other classes is, like, playing this on turn 1 is actually really good for the deck it's intended to be in, because that deck has, like, the least amount of very important 1-drops. Like, if you're playing red, white, or green, white, you have 1-drops that, like, you would rather be doing than putting this on the board. So when this is intended for a deck where that space is unoccupied, it's going to be relatively low cost to just set it up, but then paying the additional mana to do the other things are kind of just like, are you able to consistently remove game pieces from the board to where you can take off a turn doing this? If you are, then this is okay. So I think this is probably a C level card to C+, because your deck needs to be relatively reactive oriented in order to take full advantage of the level 2 and level 3. And I think if you're only consistently taking advantage of level 1, it's not really a premium card, and it probably could be a more impactful card in your deck. So I think I'm just going to give this a C. Could see it as a combo piece in Constructed for sure. That card was definitely more intended for Constructed and probably very good in Commander too. Next up, we have Thundertrap Trainer. This is 1 and a blue for a 1/2 otter wizard, and the artwork is fire. This has Offspring 4 to create a 1/1 copy, and when this enters, look at the top 4 of your library and reveal a non-creature, non-land, put it into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library. So for 2 mana, I'm able to look at the top 4 and add a spell for a later turn, maybe the same turn. And if I pay 4 mana, I can do that twice. That seems okay. I mean, you're leaving behind a 1/2 body. I think I would like this card more if it provided prowess, and I think it would be more flavorful to the theme of otters. It's kind of difficult to evaluate what this does and what its impact is, because I think without actually playing with the cards, the otters deck is the one that's probably one of the more difficult to interpret, like the initial play pattern. Yeah, I think this card is probably just like a C+ level card. I think that if you have the opportunity to be paying 4 mana to create a 1/1 and, like, not really advancing your game state much, once again, just like the last card, you're probably already in a good situation which tells me this is another one of those cards where it's like, it's okay, but in order to reach the full ceiling of this card, it's kind of win more. You have to already be in a position of I'm controlling the game for it to be valuable to you. And then it's like, when we think about what deck is trying to go tall, I would say the deck that's trying to go tall the most is probably the red-green deck, but a lot of those cards have trample on them anyway, so the body really isn't providing you that much support. So realistically, this is just a turn 2 searcher, which tells me that this is probably just a C+ within the Otters deck, and probably becomes drastically better if you have some bomb, like, non-creature cards in the deck, right? The better your quality of cards is, the more valuable than this is. But I think at face value, we're going to look past the Offspring 4 and just say this is a 2-drop. And assuming you have things to be doing with the Otter keyword, it's probably a C+. Next up, we have Valley Floodcaller. This is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 Otter with Flash. You may cast non-creature spells as though they had Flash. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, birds, frogs, otters, and rats get +1/+1 until end of turn and untap them. Wow, this is a really good card. I think this card is honestly a lot more fair than the white version of what we saw being the Lord from that color is. But I still think this card is very valuable. I think the more like sorceries that you have, the more valuable this becomes, which I think is much more easily acquirable than it seems at first glance. I mean, just being able to untap all of your stuff is really nice, especially when you like look at it as like, this gives you the benefit to all creature types within the blue space, which means this can really only be so bad. Just as the White Lord was, I think this card's really valuable and can potentially land in multiple different archetypes, which makes me think this is a B-, but more of a build-around effect, as in order to reach the full ceiling, you do kind of already want to be doing the non-creature thing, but even if you're not, it's still just a valuable card to have. Next up, we have Wishing Well. This is 3 and a blue for an artifact. Tap to put a coin counter on this, and when you do, you may cast target instant or sorcery with mana value equal to the number of coins from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that spell would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. Activate only as a sorcery. So, my issue with this card is just very slow, and I think that more often than not, you're not just going to be able to go 1, 2, 3, 4 and get an immense amount of value out of this. And I tend to think from what we have seen thus far that putting this out on turn 4 and getting a 1-drop for free immediately is not enough immediate impact to combat you paying 4 mana to relatively not advance your game state in a meaningful way. If your deck is already situated with like, you know, a good mana curve to take advantage of this, and you already have strong AoEs and you just want another value engine, it could be okay. But for the most part, I'm just thinking this is too slow. So I think most likely this will be a D+, but it could be a C- if you have the right setup for it. It just requires a lot of work, and the ability only activating as a sorcery is kind of detrimental to this card being effective. I don't even think the card would be unfair if it wasn't only as a sorcery, but for some reason we just have to make one of the more fair decks even fair. All right, moving on to the Mythics. We have Aluge, the Shoreless Sea. This is 1 and triple blue for a legendary creature, elemental fish, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of islands you control. Whenever this enters or attacks, you may put a flood counter on target land. It is an island in addition to other types, as long as it has that counter on it. And then the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn cost 1 blue or 1 colorless less to cast for each land you control with a flood counter on it. So I guess assuming that you are like primarily almost just a straight up mono blue deck, this card is fire. But I would like to assume that that's not going to be the case more often than not. The impact is relatively nice, but I think you really have to have a lot going for you and in what your deck is trying to do to take full advantage of this card. Because at minimum, I'm really looking to control 4 islands to even bring this up to base level stats. And even at that point, I do have to have things that are worth reducing their costs to actually make me feel like I'm getting enough value for my buck. And then beyond that, it's just triple blue, which is just really difficult to do, especially in a format where the fixing is relatively bad, especially in blue. So I would like to say this is probably a C-. It's by no means unplayable, but I think more often than not, you're not going to be in the best position to be able to consistently extract as much value from this card as I would like. Next up, we have Kitsa Otterball Elite. It is a 1 and a blue legendary otter, and this picture is dope as fuck. It is a 1/3 with vigilance and prowess, and you may tap it to draw a card, then discard a card, or you may pay 2 and tap it to copy an instant or sorcery you control and choose new targets of the copy. Activate only if this creature's power is 3 or greater. So what you're telling me is in order to copy an instant or sorcery, I have to be able to play 2 instants or sorceries within that turn, which I think is okay, but I think more so just the combination of vigilance, prowess, and looting makes this just a valuable card on its own. And I think even if you can't trigger the 3rd ability, it's probably well worth it to put this in, especially if you were in the otter space. But even if you're not, it's probably just a C+ level card. So I think within the otter space, this is probably a B level card if you think you have a good chance of being able to trigger the bottom ability, and probably a B- if you aren't sure. So the floor can only be really so low on this just for what you're getting. So I think this card is awesome, and I'm very excited to play with it. Magic Arena, do not cuckold me. Let me see the mythic rare I want to see. I want to play otters. I'm the otter OG. All right, next up, we have Season of Weaving. This is 4 and double blue for a sorcery. Once again, we are back with the pause. You may choose up to 5 pause worth of modes, and you may choose the same mode more than once. At 1 paw, you can draw a card. At 2, you can choose an artifact or creature you control and create a token that is a copy of it. Or 3, you can return each non-land, non-token permanent to its owner's hand. Wow, that's cool. So for 6 mana, let's say the most likely outcome is that we're going to bounce the board and then we're going to draw 2 cards. That's great. I mean, there is a card that is 6 mana that says bounce 2 creatures, then you get to draw 2, discard 1. And people already seem to think that that is a decent card. So if you think that card's decent, then this card is definitely above rate, especially with the modularity of if you are ahead on the board and you don't want to AoE, you can just create a copy of an artifact or creature you control. So I mean, if you're just creating 2 copies of something and then drawing a card, that's great. And then also the fact that it doesn't return tokens means you could create a copy of your best creature and then also bounce the board. So this card is just versatile, and I think no matter what set of modes you choose, you're just getting way more for what you're paying for. And especially if we think about it within the otter space, if you have access to the gold card and reduce the cost of this card to 5, then this card is nutty. I think this is a B+ level card, maybe even an A-. Honestly, I'm going to go with A- just because I think this card is actually slightly better than the previous paw card we saw, since it's like this card just covers for every scenario. It's good when you're behind, it's good when you're ahead, and it breaks the board when you guys are even. So this card is just great in all scenarios, and that is my description of an A, so I'm going with A. I'm going to give it an A minus though because it is double blue and that will not always be accessible to you. It's primarily going to be best within the red-blue space. All right, our final Mythic is from the bonus sheet, and we have an alternate art version of Ledger Shredder. This is a OG Hood classic. It is 1 in a blue for a 1/3 bird with flying, and whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, you get to connive, meaning you draw 1, then discard 1, and put a 1/1 counter on this if it is a non-land card. And the flavor text is fire. Pa, you call this comprehensive? I'm nest stuff. I call this nest stuffing. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, this is a badass card. I'm not gonna lie. Whenever I hear the Ledger Shredder in the flavor text, I just immediately think that Ledger Shredder is a Chad. Chad love using connive. Chad love non-lands. Ha ha ha. I mean, this card is obviously just going to be good. It's going to be good in the Flyers deck because it's going to be a bird. And it's also just going to be good in the red-blue decks. There's some overlap there. And I think this is it's just a powerful card in every cube I've played in. And cubes are typically higher power level than these standard sets, which tells me that this is probably just a B+ level card. Like, it's funny because whenever this first came out, I actually drafted this in one of the few IRL drafts I was able to go to. And I didn't even play Constructed at that time. And I immediately found out how good this card was. So I think this card is amazing, and I'm glad to see it return. Also, the artwork is fire. FYE, baby. All right, that's going to be our last blue card here. So we're now going to move on to... Let's do the red cards next. Let's mix it up. Hold on. For the technical difficulties, wait for me to pull up the cards. I can only have so many tabs open at once. Sorry for the intermission. Go ahead and take this time to step outside, smoke a cigar, do whatever you need to do. Go touch grass, go interact with a female. I'll wait. Default. Man, we have a lot of cards to go through. Shout out to anyone who actually has been watching this full time. I value and appreciate you as a young, jitted community member. Nope, Wizards, don't take me to this extra tab. I didn't ask for this. And unfortunately, I forgot last time to do the colorless cards, so we're going to do those at the end. There's not very many of them, so it shouldn't take much longer. Go to the bonus sheet here. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull up the green ones while we're at it here. How's everybody doing today? It is a wonderful Monday to start the week, to be prepared for the onslaught that will be Burrow Day 1. Make sure to dodge me on the ladder because there's a reason they call me the boat. And it's because goats come and go and boats stay afloat. And that's where they call me the best drafter of all time, baby. Man, I hate all the filters on the Wizard site, but it's probably the best way to pull up this information. Let me know what archetype you guys are most excited for. Personally, I thought I was most excited for the green-blue deck, just because I'm a simp for green-blue, but not for the females. But now I'm thinking that red-blue otters is probably going to be the one I'm the most excited for. Just because I feel like it probably has the most non-linear play pattern, and those are the kind of puzzles that I'm looking to solve within draft to get me going. Oh wow, green actually only has 2 mythics? That's crazy. Every other color has 3 mythics. That's very interesting. All the green haters out there, at the Wizards of the Coast headquarters, let them know that Beats by Ash said we need to have equality between the colors, especially the green colors. Like if it was like blue or like red that only had two, I'd be like, okay. But don't do that to my green mages out there. You know what I'm saying? Oh shit, green gets 2 special guests though. We're making up for it. All right, so because of the way that I pulled up the tabs, we're actually going to do green first. We are actually going to do green. And one moment, let me go ahead and fill up my drink real quick before we get into this. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to rock and roll. Can I get a drum roll for all the green mages out there? I got some ice in my cup. I got that tea. And my glasses are pre-wiped off, and I also pet the dog for good luck. It means we're going to have some good green cards, baby. I believe. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything in the chat. Stream babs be late as fuck on the Rumble. You know how it be. All right, the level 6 this has been put in. We are indeed on the 6 bombers. The green spells are about to pop off here. I hope everyone appreciates my my podcasting voice because this is going to be a long stretch. All right, we are back with green, and our first card is Fecund Greenshell. This is 3 and 2 green for a 4/6 elemental turtle with reach. As long as you control 10 or more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever this or another creature you control with toughness greater than its power enters, look at the top card of your library. If it is a land, you may put it on the battlefield, otherwise put it into your hand. So what I'm saying is, you didn't learn your lesson from creating Nadu.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not be alerted. This is just budget Nadu for the draft format exclusively. This card is obviously disgusting. Let's all be real with ourselves here. The inner green mage inside of us wants to believe that this first passive ability to give everyone +2/+2 is realistic. It just fucking isn't. Let's be real. But he doesn't need that. You're getting 5 mana for a 4/6 reach, and I want to point out this one more time for anyone who's missed the previous iterations of this series. Why the fuck does every card in this set have secret reach? Like literally, like I almost feel like the flyer decks are going to be at an innate disadvantage because I feel like if you're going against a good person, just ignore that your creatures have flying other than like innate bonuses between your cards. Because pretty much just everybody and their mother has reach. Like, dude, this guy is a fucking turtle. He's literally just laying on the ground, and somehow he has reach. Brother, what are we doing here? But on a real note, though, all you have to do is select a creature with toughness greater than its power, and you get to Nadu effect, and that's not once per turn. So in some regards, this is actually, if we take infinite combos out of the equation, and we just look at Nadu Winged Wisdom through the looking glass of how it performed in MH3 draft, this could be arguably considered better in terms of its impact on this format versus the other format, because I think it's going to be a lot more easy for you to start with this card and select cards that have higher toughness than power, because most of your good cards that are overstated are going to have like a stat line like that. So it just makes them a bonus. And you get immediate value from this, unlike Nadu, being able to Nadu trigger whenever this enters the battlefield. So I think this is actually our first easy A here. I think you might be able to consider this even an A+, but I think it's going to be very dependent on how good is green. I am a green mage to die for all day, but I think we have to be true to ourselves here and put into perspective that pretty much, like my friend in the chat said before, most of the good decks, or a lot of the good decks, are very low to the ground and aggressive. Even the red-green deck, which could be the most powerful green archetype in the format, is essentially aggressively slanted. It's just doing it in a more mid-rangey fashion, but a lot of their cards have trample. They're trying to attack with their cards. This is more of a defensively slanted card, but I don't think that really matters based on the value generation. So I think this is either an A or an A+, but not much needs to be said. He is a war turtle that is running around flinging nectar at people, and that is just goated. Our next card is For the Common Good. This is green and 2 instances of X. For a sorcery, create X tokens that are copies of another token you control. Then tokens you control gain indestructible until your next turn. You gain 1 life for each token you control. Okay, let me think about this. let's say we play this for 5 mana. That means we're going to be creating 2 tokens that are a copy of another token. Those gain indestructible until your next turn. So my issue with this card is I may be overlooking this, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the chat or in the comments if you're watching this later on YouTube. I feel like for the most part, the decks that want to be creating tokens are either Offspring or the green-white deck, and none of those tokens seem to be statted insanely high, which tells me that like the average value you're going to be getting on this card is not really the best, right? Like, I think in most scenarios, the tokens that you have in the green-white deck, which is the most prevalent token strategy, are 1/1 rabbits with no inherent effects, which tells me this card is really bad. And I almost feel like it could have just had one instance of X, just considering the overall value of all tokens in this format. Even if it only had one X, it would probably only be busted in like some scenarios. Maybe just remove one X and increase the amount of green to 2 green. I think that'd probably be a better structure for this card. But I don't think this is going to be one that you're looking to include in your decks. And even if you have like an established green-white deck and you get this pack 3, you're probably moderately interested at the most. And I think the 1 life is extremely negligible. Because when you think about what the green-white deck is trying to do, it's inherently aggressive, which means that your life total is less beneficial than it would be in a control deck, where that would be a more relevant effect because maybe you're behind. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a D+, but I will happily be wrong because it looks like a very fun card. All right, our next card is Innkeeper's Talent, another one of the classes. Back at it again with another banger/dud of a class. It is 1 in a green, and level 1 at the beginning of combat, put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. Holy shit. Level 2 for 1 green. Permanents you control with counters on them have ward 1.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
That is already insane. Level 3 for 3 in a green. If you would put 1 or more counters on permanents or players, put twice that many counters of each of those kind on that permanent or player instead. Wow. It's really weird to me how this class, the level up abilities could be arguably considered undercosted, and as well the put into play ability versus the other ones which seem to be overcosted. And then the impact of these abilities are arguably higher impact than some of the ones that had higher cost to level up. Like, I feel like they just couldn't get a good middle ground with a lot of these, and I think this one is on more of the side that it's just bonkers. So as we've seen in the past, in previous like draft formats, not even just standard, but in most of the formats I played in, where there was an effect that allowed you to continuously put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control every turn, those cards tended to cost 3 and were like very, very impactful. So I think even at level 1, you feel really, really good about having this card in your deck. And the fact level 2 only costs 1 green is absurdly vile. Like, as soon as you give 1 to 2 things ward 1, you're just like, screw the rules, I have money. Like, screw the rules, I have mana. Like, fuck it, this card's broken. Honestly, I think this is an A- level card. Like, if this was just level 1 only and it wasn't like a class card, I think it's still just like a B level card. But the fact that the additional levels are fairly costed, arguably undercosted, make this card absurd. Now, I think this card will probably be best in the green-white strategy because you're going to be going wide, which means the ward probably has like higher impact. Plus, some of your cards will just already have counters on them, which is great. But there are equal merits to be playing this in pretty much any green deck. Most notably going to be the green-blue deck as well. Because like their gold card does allow you to put a 1/1 counter on it by blinking something. So I actually like this card a lot, and I'm going to give this an A-. My hopes are high for green, and I actually really like this card. This is a card that I think you are very happy to pick up, pick one, pack one, and build around. All right, our next card is Keen-Eyed Curator, and he is playing Fruit Ninja. He is 2 green for a 3/3 Raccoon. As long as there are 4 or more card types among cards exiled with this creature, it gets +4/+4 and trample, and has an ability to exile a card from a graveyard for 1 colorless. So at face value, pretty much anyone who is able to play minimum 10 green sources is immediately interested in this card. Probably to get the most value, you would like to have 11, but I think it's fair to be able to play this with 10. Now, exiling things from the graveyard is going to be most relevant versus the green-black forage strategy, and as well as the blue-black threshold strategy. I'm not going to lie, if you have this versus a threshold deck, it's just a straight blowout. And I think if you are in like a Pro Tour draft or a high-level draft, if you are locked into threshold, this card becomes a relatively high pick within that pod, because the opportunity cost of letting this go to have someone else have it in their deck against you is very, very scary. So that's very similar to Meltdown, which we saw in MH3, where if you were locked into the artifact space, Meltdown was red and X to exile all artifacts of mana value X or less. And it was a card that you would not main deck because your deck has artifacts, but you didn't want other people to have it. I know that's less relevant on Arena, but I do want to mention that for anyone who plans on playing in person, because that is quite relevant. Now, I will say this card is obviously premium stats for what you're paying, but once again, we have to go back to you being predominantly green. Assuming that you can afford the mana to play this on turn 2 consistently, card is great. But because of the mana, I think I'm going to go with a B-. I do think it is relatively possible, though, for you to at least acquire some impact on exiling a card from the graveyard, even if this doesn't get to exile 4 cards. Because, for example, there are some cards we have already reviewed within the red-blue space that care about like returning instants or sorceries from the graveyard to hand. And since this is an instant, it's pretty good. So I'm going to go with build around B-. And when I say build around, I just mean, do you have the mana sources to efficiently play this by turn 2? Next up, we have Mist Breath Elder. This is 1 green for a 2/2 frog. At the beginning of your upkeep, return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, put a 1/1 counter on this. Otherwise, you may return this to its hand. So at worst, it's a 1 mana 2/2, which is already insane with the frog tag. And then at best, you get to bounce something every turn and grow this for free. That's amazing. I think the frog deck is the one that's most interested in this. But honestly, considering it is potentially viable within the green-white space if you have ETBs. Because there are token generators on ETB within the green-white space, which I think is fine. But I do actually really like this card. I'm going to give this a build around B-, because you don't want to just have to keep bouncing things. But the stats you're getting for playing it, if your opponent is required to devote a resource to answer this, you're very happy. Like, 1 mana 2/2 is great. The additional bonus effect, even better. The fact it's a may return this to this owner's hand, that's great. I don't know why you would want to return this to its owner's hand. I guess to trigger your other frogs. All right, our next card is Paw Patch Recruit. Not Patchwork. 1 green for a 2/1 rabbit with Offspring 2 to create a 1/1 token. It has trample, And when a creature becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control other than that creature. So 1 mana, 2/1 with trample. I already like that in the rabbit space. And then it prohibits your opponent. It negatively affects them for targeting your stuff. And potentially, if you have an overlap, utilizing some of the white cards with Valiant, you can generate Valiant triggers, which makes me think this is a pretty good card. Because more often than not, it's just going to be a 1 mana, 2/1 with trample, which is already just really good in an aggressive deck. But with the additional optionality of increasing the ceiling, it's a very strong card. I think this is probably a C+ card. I think that it has really good stats. And don't get me wrong, you are happy to start with this. At the same time, I don't think the impact is insane. I think it's just overstated for what you're paying for, and that's great. But if Rabbits isn't open, I feel kind of weird with this card. It very easily, if you already have all the stuff set up for it, could just be a B level card though. Next up, we have Scrap Shooter. This is 1 and double green for a 4/4 raccoon and reach. Whenever this enters, if you gift your opponent a card, destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. So once again, we have to go back to my statement about you having enough lands to play this card. Ideally 11, but if you're playing 10, that's equally as fine. The ability to optionally give your opponent a card to kill a powerful class. If they have a Bong class, you're always doing that. If they have that green class, that's out of there, you get a card. That's fine. So I actually really like this card. And I actually feel like I'm slightly more happy with the gift mechanic than I was at first glance in terms of gifting a card. Because since the fixing isn't relatively great in this set, it's actually very poor. There are times where more often than in this set than other sets, gifting your opponent a card does not give them a card that is immediately impactful to the game state. And I mean, 40% of the time, they're going to get a land. So I think this card's good. I don't think it's a start card. I think it's not pulling me into raccoons, but if I'm doing the thing, it's cool. So I'm going to give this a C+. All right, our next card is Tender Wild Guide. He's got them tenderloins, boys. Watch out. Protect your tenderloins. 1 and a green for a 2/2 Possum Druid, which are completely irrelevant types to this format. One thing I want to point out about this format is, since it's a creature type based format based around tribes, it's honestly just completely unnecessary that they have all these secondary types like Possum. I understand that. That's fine. Immediately tells me it's not from one of the specific tribes, but then Druid. Every card has Druid or Warlock. How does that help you? Why is that in here? There better at least be something in the commander decks that has something to do with those secondary types, because if not, you're kind of just baiting newer players who are oh, my friends told me this is a tribal-based set. I'm collecting Druids. And then they realize, oh shit, Druid doesn't mean shit. But enough about that. It is a 2 mana 2/2 with Offspring 2 to create a 1/1 copy. You may tap it to add 1 mana of any color, or you may tap it to put a 1/1 counter on this creature. Good card. 2 mana mana dork that potentially grows. This actually might power creep some of the mana dorks within standard currently, because we are rotating out some of them. And it's not like we have Delighted Halfling in standard. The Offspring is kind of cool. I guess it could be most efficiently used to guarantee your fixing of splashing a bomb rare, which is kind of funny because I need to have a bomb rare in order to facilitate my other bomb rare. But I mean, most likely it's just a 2 mana 2/2 mana dork with the ability to put a 1/1 on it, which I think is a huge upside, because there's going to be some times where you don't actually want to go 2/4. Maybe you don't have a 4-drop. Maybe it's just better for you to go 3 into 4. And then in those cases, you still have an additional thing to be doing with this card to advance your game state. which I do really like about this card. And it's just like, I think the red-green deck wants it the most. But I think green decks in general that are playing a rare from another color are also going to be interested in this. I've heard that the Sultai combination is like probably the most relevant 3-color strategy. So probably also very relevant in that strategy. I'm going to give this a B- because I do think it's premium for what you're getting. But I'm not going to sit here and say that it's like a game-ending effect. Overall, very awesome design, and I actually really like this approach to a Mana Dork. All right, next up we have Thorn Vault Forager. This is 1 and a green for a 2/2 squirrel. Tap to add a green. Forage, add 2 mana in any combination. And 3 and a green to tap it and search your library for a squirrel. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Wow, this card's great. This card is amazing. I think in the green-black decks, this is a B+ to A- level cards because you're getting fixing potentially, you're getting guaranteed ramp, and you're getting guaranteed card advantage and infinite value engine within the squirrel space being green-black. So green-black is most interested in this. I think red-green is just interested in a 2-mana Mana Dork as well, especially since some of the food cards overlap. This card is just good. Is this better? I think it's slightly worse overall than the last Mana Dork, but I think it's better specifically within the green-black squirrel space. So I think I'm just going to give this one a B. I think it's good in multiple green archetypes. Very easily could be a B+ to A- level card within the squirrel space. And I think you're very happy to be able to start with this in pick 1. And for anyone that's interested, I will be working on a 17 lands tier list that I will eventually link either in the Discord most likely or at the bottom of some of my draft videos early on. But I just want to make sure I get an opportunity to play with the cards before I start giving anyone evidence. I want to make sure that what I'm doing is actually confirmed beneficial to people because I'm not trying to pretend to be a fake expert like a lot of these posers out here. Next up, we have Valley Mightcaller. This is 1 green for a 1/1 trample. Whenever another frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel enters, put a 1/1 counter on it, and it is a frog type as well. So this is another one of those cards. It's kind of interesting because, like, I feel like the green rares are, like, crazy. Like, I don't think we've seen hardly any bad green rares comparatively to what we've seen thus far. And I actually kind of like that, but I don't like that, like, green seems kind of like most oriented out of the colors we've seen to where I'm going green because I have a rare. Because there's a lot of rares that kind of tell you to do that, which can kind of mess up the draft. But overall, this seems like a good card. You know, it's a versatile card in multiple archetypes. I think, honestly, the rabbit deck is probably most interested in this since it's the most aggressively slanted out of the aggressive green, out of all the green decks. Just because, you know, you're going to be building a board presence. There are multiple cards that just give you, like, there's a 3-mana white card that gives you 3 1/1 rabbits, and then that gives you 3 1/1 counters, making this a 4/4 trample, which is great. Yeah, that is absolutely great, and I think this is probably a card you're willing to start with since it counts all green types. That's typically been the story with all the cards we've seen that count all of the types within that color. It makes me want to go this color, and it benefits me for doing the thing. It's also only 1 green, which is great. Like, this can easily get out of control, so I'm going to give this a B. All right, that is our last green rare. We are now going to be moving on to the Mythics, and our first one is Lumra, Bellow of the Woods. This is 4 green for a legendary creature, Elemental. It has Vigilance and Reach, and the power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. When this enters, mill 4 cards, then return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this is a good card. I'm not going to say this is a bad card, but I think you don't actually want it within the green-white space because the curve is too high. I think you're primarily interested in this in the green-blue space, the green-red space, maybe green-black, but green-black is also kind of mid-range oriented. So I think primarily green-red and green-blue are going to be most enticed by this, but green-black could be fine too. Because milling 4 cards does accelerate your potential to forage. It's just a little bit late. It's a very defensive card. But if you get this on the field, it's going to be minimum 6/6. And then depending on how many lands you mill, let's say on average, since 40% of your deck is lands, it's going to be 7/7. So 6 mana for a 7/7 Vigilance Reach that has the potential to grow. Really good in any non-very aggressive deck. I think this is just a straight up B. Because the more aggressive low to the ground decks are not going to be as interested in this. There's going to be some times where you actually have a green-black or a green-red deck where you're actually just trying to be more mid-rangey, and you might not want to try to get up to 6 to be able to have this. Because I think a lot of people underestimate the aspect in draft of, okay, this is a powerful card. If I get to this, it's awesome. But there is a secondary depreciating cost of how long this has to sit in my hand before I extract any value. If I get to play this and it ends up being, a 7/7, but I didn't get to play it till turn 8, most games will have been decided by then. And if I didn't get enough mana to do that until that turn, it's probably not worth having the dead card in my hand that long. Which tells me the control decks or the later game oriented decks are really the only ones interested in this. So I'm going to give this a B-. Because I do think it requires some setup. It requires double green. You kind of have to be trying to do the thing. You kind of want to have mana dorks to, get the most value out of this. But overall, it is a good card. It's just you kind of need to be trying to do this thing. You don't just want to throw it in just because you're in green. All right, boys and girls, it's time for another paw card. Back at it again with another paw banger of a card. Season of Gathering. This is 4 double green for a sorcery. Choose up to 5 paw worth of modes. You know the deal. You can choose the same mode multiple times. You can pay 1 to put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. It gains Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. 2 to choose an artifact or enchantment, destroy all permanents of the chosen type, and 3 to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So, I think this card is definitely better for the green-red and as well the green-white decks, because those are the ones that are trying to cheat out the most creatures. Which I do think that this is probably most beneficial within the white space. That's the archetype that's going to give you the most value of level 1. Green-red can get good value out of that too because, getting Vigilance on your guys with good toughness is great. But I'm a little bit skeptical on that being the main incentive for putting this in that deck because a lot of the good cards within that archetype already provide you with Vigilance and Trample. So at that point, you're just getting 1/1 counters. I mean, would you pay 6 mana to put 5 1/1 counters with a potential additional upside? Probably. It's probably okay. The fact you can choose where they go. Now, it is important to note that 1 paw mode does not target. It just says put on a creature you control, which means if you are playing white Valiant cards, you do not get the benefits of that, which is kind of a neg for that archetype. The secondary mode, I think, is the most situational. And then level 3 is most beneficial to red-green. Could be okay if you just have, the uncommon elemental at 6/6 in your green-black or your green-blue. But I think more times than not, this is probably most beneficial to the green-red archetype because they can get some value out of Module 1 and they can get a lot of value out of Module 3. it's hard to say if all of these season cards or these paw cards are just all A's. I feel like this is the weakest one we've seen thus far, but I still think it's very powerful. I think I'm just going to go with B. It is a high-costed card that I do not think benefits you when you're already behind on the board. And I think that's what it has going against it versus the other ones. Because like the last one that we looked at was good both while you were ahead and behind. And that one was from blue, right? Yeah, so the blue and white ones were both good while you're ahead or behind. This one is pretty much only good if you're even or ahead, which does have a neg to it, but it is still very impactful. So I think I'm just going to go with B on this one. All right, now we're on to our bonus sheet for green here. We have Sylvan Tutor. This is 1 green sorcery, a reprint. Search your library for a creature card, reveal it, shuffle, put that card on the top. A lot of people have said this is just a straight F, and honestly, I would disagree because the way that I look at this card is, do you have a game-winning bomb, right? Like, if anyone played during Wilds of Eldraine draft, there was a card called Gruff Triplets, which may or may not have been the highest game-in-hand win rate card out of all rares in the set. And it was just a 6-mana bomb that when you put it on the battlefield, it was very, very low likelihood your opponent was going to be able to beat you. And there was another card that was 1 mana. I think it was like something Convoke to Nature. And it let you look at the top 5 to add a creature card to hand. And that card was very bad, but if you had a Gruff Triplets, that card was very good. And I think considering this allows you to isolate that bomb, if you do just have an A-level card, I think that this card is worth it. If you don't, then obviously, yeah, like it's an F, you're not going to play it. But I do think that if you have a bomb, you should play this, and don't let people tell you this is just a straight F, especially if you have multiple bombs and you can like provide a different set of like situational value. I think that's great. And if you don't have any, like let's say you have like one of those 2-mana powerful dorks, you don't have any 1-drops in your deck. But playing this on 1, you're going neg 1, you're getting a bomb. So I mean, I think it just depends on what bombs you have, if this is good. But I really love the artwork on it. Next up, we have Toski, Bearer of Secrets. This is 3 and a green for a 1/1 legendary squirrel. This spell can be countered, indestructible, and whenever it attacks each combat if able. And then whenever a creature you control deals combat damage, draw a card. So we saw this in that one Viking set. I think it was Kaldheim. Card was really good in that set. I think it's actually even better in this set because it is a squirrel. So I think it was like a B+ in the Kaldheim set. I'm going to go with A- because it is squirrel type, which is very relevant. It is also 4 cost, which means it triggers your expend mechanic within red-green. So it actually has like a couple innate synergies to being a part of this set versus other ones. And I think this is probably the biggest W for Wizards on a bonus sheet. Because number 1, this was a needed reprint for Commander players. I know we gotta adhere to the Commander players, guys. They're the only people spending money. And then like, it's also just really flavorful with the set and provides innate synergies, and the artwork is badass. Like, I wish I could grow a beard that would be half as badass as this guy. But obviously I can't, so I'm gonna have to overcompensate by selecting multiple bombs to be in my deck. All right, moving on to red here. We have Artist Talent. This is 1 in a red for a class card. At level 1, when you cast a non-creature, you may discard a card and draw a card. So at the cost of 2 mana, we get looting anytime we play a non-creature. I mean, I think that's something that red-blue is relatively interested in. At level 2 for 2 in a red, non-creature spells cost 1 less to cast. Holy shit, that's something I'm very interested in. I'm very high on the red-blue gold card that reduces the cost of instants and sorceries by 1. So I think I'm going to be even higher on this card. Because number 1, it doesn't require 2 different colors of mana. Number two, having non-creature spells being reduced and then them also providing looting and that looting ability not being once per turn makes this even better because it doesn't seem like you need to be like a lot of the cards that provide enchantment removal in this set don't necessarily give it to you for free, which tells me the enchantments are going to be some of the most irritating things to be combating versus like the bomb creatures. And this is right up there with that. At level 3 for 2 and a red, if a source you control would deal non-combat damage, then it deals that much +2. That's great. Wow. So all of these things build up at an appropriate rate and the cost is very fair. And this is very buildable around. Like this makes me want to enter red-blue. And I have high expectations for this card because it does require work. I think I'm just going to give this a build around B, but it very well could be a B plus if you have the correct setup. I just don't think everyone is interested in this. It's very much so, I'm taking this pick 1. I'm going to close my eyes and hopefully I'm past the red and blue cards. And I honestly think that red and blue is probably going to end up being one of the more underdrafted color pairs, specifically because in my mind at face value, a lot of the cards and the card types that archetype is interested in drastically contrast with the other archetypes where, for example, a lot of the green-white and green-red cards have some amount of overlap. Similarly with green-black, I don't think that like red-blue has the most overlap with like red-white. I don't think it has the most overlap with red-black, which makes me think that like learning how to draft this deck is going to be very beneficial because I think it's going to be at least somewhat more open than the more aggressive strategies. Next up, we have Byway Barterer. Oh shit, we got a barterer in the house. Shout out all my Middle Eastern homies. 2 and a red for a 3/3 rogue raccoon. I don't know why I said rogue. Rogue means nothing. Put it in the garbage with your Assassin's Creed cards. Menace, whenever you expend 4, you may discard your hand and draw 2 cards. Okay. So I think like this card is somewhat not like, I don't think it's immediately clear what the impact of this is without me personally being able to have drafted and played with the red-green deck yet. I think it's a powerful effect. I would like to assume that when you're playing red-green, you're trying to just like regurgitate your hand on the board as fast as possible. And there are like multiple ramping mechanisms that allow you to facilitate that. But if that's not like consistently the case for whatever reason in your deck, it's probably a higher cost to discard your hand. Because I will say, while the red-green deck is aggressively slanted and there are mana dorks, a lot of the good mana dorks are at higher rarities than common. And overall, your cards are going to be at least somewhat higher cost than the red-white deck and as well as the green-white deck and even the red-black deck. Which means that you might actually have a slower time getting on the board, especially if they're developing first and you're required to like respond to their board then develop your own. In any card game, for anyone who cares about this, there are 2 innate actions. Number 1, you are either the person who is developing the board or you are the person who is going to have to respond to the board. Now, 9 times out of 10, whenever I coach people, I like to tell them that if you don't have the opportunity to respond to your opponent's board while also developing your own, it's probably going to be better to just develop your own. But obviously, like, there's going to be some situations where that's not the case. But that is just important to, like, know, like, with this card, because if your opponent's deck is way faster than you, you may have to be the person who is responding to the other person's board, which could very easily slow down the continuous benefits of this card, right? So I think at face value, because it is 3/3 Menace, which really can't be that bad, this is probably a B- card. I don't think that this effect by any means tells me like, oh shit, if I have this and I draft red-green, my deck's going to be disgusting. It's more so of like, okay, I see this, I'm somewhat interested in red-green, but if you show me a more open thing to do with, overall higher quality cards, I'm not bent against like pivoting off of this. So I think this is a B- level card, and realistically the red-green deck is the only one that's interested in this. Like some other strategies might have like medium interest at the most, but I think it's primarily a red-green card. All right, next up we have Ember Heart Challenger. This is 1 in a red for a 2/2 mouse with haste and prowess. Valiant, you may exile the top card of your library until the end of your turn. You may play that card. Wow. This card immediately has standard implications. Now, we have seen a long history in standard of 2/2s with haste that provide an additional effect being very, very valuable. And with the rotation happening tomorrow, I think this card might actually find a place in some of the aggressive decks, maybe like mono red. Especially, like if you're playing a mono red deck where traditionally you would have like Slick Shot Show Off, you would have like Monastery Swift Spear. This fits right in there with that theme. And the Valiant ability is honestly just unnecessary. The card would be immediately good without it. Now, what I do think puts this card above is that with the Prowess ability, I think you're innately also at worst happy to play this in a red-blue deck. Like, obviously, this isn't like insane in the red-blue deck, but it's on level with the red-blue gold card. Like, Prowess is a big component of that strategy, and so I think it finds a good home in there. And in the red-white deck, it's obviously just insane. Even in the red-black deck, like, you're interested in this in every single color as long as you are somewhat aggressive, even if you cannot consistently facilitate the Valiant ability. And if you can, if you know that, like, there's a 50-50 chance you're going to be able to trigger this 1 to 2 times per match, this card's absurd. I think this is a B+ level card. No, I'm going to go A- because everyone is interested in this, and the floor is incredibly high, and the ceiling is like not that much higher, but the floor is just so fucking high. Like the floor of this is higher than the ceiling of a lot of other rares. So I think this is just an A- card, and in the Valiant red-white deck, it's an A+ card. Like this might be one of the most irritating bomb rares to play against, because, when we're looking at bombs, we need to be thinking about what is the play window of this card. Okay, it's good early. Has a very high floor if you play it early. It's good late. It has a very high ceiling if you play it late. It's good at every point in the game, and it has the keyword that I'm looking for in that archetype. The card is absurd. Next up, we have Festival of Embers. This is 4 and a red for an enchantment. During your turn, you may cast instant and sorceries from your graveyard by paying 1 life in addition to their other costs. If a card or token would be put into the graveyard, exile it instead. And then you can pay 1 and a red to sacrifice this. Okay. So I think this is probably just going to be a D. The effect is impactful. Don't get me wrong. But the red-blue deck is the deck that's most interested in this. And if you get to a point in the game with the red-blue deck, which is a relatively late-game oriented deck compared to, the red-white and green-white and red-black decks, and you're able to just take a turn off by having no impact on the game has already been decided. If you have the time to be able to do this, you either are in a top deck war, which is a bad justification for putting this in your deck, or you're just so far ahead that it's just a win more card. So I think this card is never going to be played. I think it's like a D, it's just a D level card. Like it's not even D+ or D-, because it is like fine in those red-blue decks. Like honestly, if you wanted to put this in the sideboard and you're playing red-blue, I'd feel very comfortable with that. Because if you're going against another control deck, another late game oriented deck, I think it would be a good inclusion to have in the side deck, but it's very risky in the main deck because I have a very strong feeling from what other people have told me, what we know at face value, that this format is going to be on the faster end of formats we have seen in the past 2 or 3 years. So probably don't play this. If you're in red-blue and you get it for free, then maybe you can put it in the side deck. And then, if you're low on playables, you could put it in. Do I have Blue Eyes White Dragon? I do actually. I have multiple Blue Eyes White Dragon. I mean, if you look on my YouTube, I posted a video where I opened the $1,000 briefcase from the Kaiba Corp collection that gave you the 3 Starlight Blue Eyes White Dragons in like the Kaiba Corp case. Next up, we have Hearthborn Battler. This is 2 and a red for a 2/3 lizard with haste. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, this deals 2 damage to that opponent. Wow. This is just a B. It is an aggressive card that only the lizard deck is interested in. And what makes this a B is that it's not just whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, each player does it, and it's not just when your opponent does it. You can cast 2 spells in 1 turn, and your opponent always takes the damage. And at 2/3 with haste, that's exactly what I'm looking for, especially because that deck has inherent synergies to your opponent losing life during your turn, which is very strong. Because if this was in any other set, I would say it would probably just be a C+. But because of those inherent synergies of triggering your other lizard effects, it makes this card probably just a B-. Like, it's just a good card. And honestly, like, in any of your aggressive red decks, you are not upset to put this in. Red-white, you're playing multiple cards per turn, not upset at all. I mean, even in the green... Or no, you can't do that. I was thinking you could play this in the green-white deck. Yeah, you can't do that. But yeah, the red-black deck and the red-white deck, both very interested in this card. Probably just going to be a B- level card. Depending on your lizard strategy, could be a focal point of the entire deck. So it could just be a B there. Next up, we have Hired Claw. This is 1 red for a 1/2 lizard. Whenever you attack with 1 or more lizards, it deals 1 damage to target opponent, and then you can pay 1 in a red to put a 1/1 counter on Hired Claw. Activate only if an opponent has lost life and once per turn. So I'm actually... Wow, when I look at this card, I don't know if you guys thought about this, but there was actually an original lizard. I think it came out in either War of the Spark or Core Set 2019 through Core Set 2020. It was a 1/1 lizard that whenever it attacks, you get to deal 1 damage to an opponent or a planeswalker. And that card was actually a staple in a lot of budget aggro decks for a long time, especially in combination with other cards that provided you like additional bonuses. Like, there were enchantments that said whenever you did like a non-combat damage to a player, it deals an additional damage. So I think this will actually find a home if those decks are somewhat viable, because it is 1/2. The previous version of this card was 1/1, and it also has an additional effect that is facilitated via the first effect, which tells me this card is very strong in the lizard deck. No one else is probably that interested in it. If you get this late within a red-white deck, you're probably fine just to play it, since it does facilitate its own second ability. It has the potential to grow, and you want as many 1-drops as possible within that deck. So I think this is just a really good card. I'm going to give it a B- as well. It's just a good card to have in the lizard deck, but it is kind of segmented. Next up, we have Manifold Mouse. This is 1 in a red for a 1/2 mouse soldier. Offspring 2 to create a 1/1 copy. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target mouse you control gains your choice of double strike or trample until end of turn.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
Holy shit, this card is broken. Wow. This is such a bomb. The fact that every turn you're able to give any of your mice double strike is broken on its own. The fact you also have the option of trample, that's so crazy. And then you can potentially get another copy of this at a fair rate to be giving two things double strike each turn, or just have some insurance to where this card isn't bad in the mid to late game. And if your opponent has one single target removal, you're still guaranteeing some instance of double strike or trample. This card is crazy. I think within the red-white mice deck, this is going to be one of the most irritating cards to play against, and I'm going to have to give this an A. Within the mice deck, this card is absurd. I don't think anyone else is really interested in this. But if you're playing lizards and you have some overlap between like just having mice from the color red within that deck, it's probably worth it enough just to put it in there. Because even being able to just use this as an attacker could probably get in for some damage to trigger your lizard procs of your opponent losing life, because the double strike is so powerful, considering you can target this itself. And it's just never a bad draw because you have that offspring. So yeah, this is one of the best red rares we've seen. Maybe one of the best red rares and one of the best rares in the set. All right, next up, we got to talk about the Boogeyman, the one that everyone has their eyes on in standard constructed play. This is Sunspine Lynx. This is 2 double red for an elemental 5/4. Players cannot gain life, damage cannot be prevented, and whenever it enters, it deals damage to each player equal to the number of non-basic lands that player controls. So, I think in the white-black bats deck, where you actually care about gaining life, this is kind of just like an end-all be-all. Like, it kind of just cucks them, you know? Like, that's pretty absurd. 4 mana 5/4 are not bad stats. Obviously, this card is going to be insane in some form or fashion and constructed when the mana bases get better progressively throughout the year and we eventually get triomes back, which I assume will happen before the next rotation. I don't think the bottom effect is relevant by any means, but I mean 4 mana 5/4 is not bad. And if you go against the bat deck, you get like an additional inherent synergy. Damage can't being prevented is like somewhat relevant. I think mostly you're probably going to play this if you're playing red-green and you need another 4-cost, fairly statted body that allows you to trigger your expend. And in that case, I think it's probably a C-level card. But outside of that, it's probably just a sideboard card, specifically if you're playing against a person with bats. And once again, if you are in a competitive in-person tournament and you are already locked into bats and see this card, it's probably a relatively high pick just because of that risk to reward of potentially going against a player in that pod who has a card that invalidates your game plan. So if you're playing the bats deck and you're in person playing against people in the same pod, relatively high value card. If you're on arena and you're in the red-green deck, it is a fairly statted 4-drop for your expend strategy, which makes it about a C. Next up, we have Valley Flamecaller. This is 2 in a red for a 3/3 lizard. If a lizard, mouse, otter, or raccoon would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals that much damage +1 instead. Okay, so this card essentially fits into primarily the red-white mice strategy and the red-black lizard strategy. So I understand there is some overlap between the raccoons and the otters, but the thing is about those decks, red-blue just isn't interested in having as many creature cards overall. And then with the raccoon deck, the additional 1 damage doesn't provide you enough value, because typically the cards that are within the 2 and 3 drop slot of those red-green decks either want to be giving you a bonus for expending or facilitate you a way to cheat out an expendable card or be a card that's just 4 cost or more, which this card is none of those things. So I think that the Raccoon and Otter phrases on this are relatively like non-applicable if your deck is primarily those types. But if your deck is, you know, all red, white mouse, or your deck is red, black lizard obviously being the mainstay, best option for this, but mice is still a decent card too. For those two archetypes, I'm going to give this card a C+, because being able to deal additional damage in aggressive strategies is just good overall, especially in the lizard strategy where you are able to, you know, work with your stuff that cares about lizards and with your stuff that, you know, your opponent loses life. Like, it doesn't, you already have to be able to trigger, but there might be some scenarios where if you're attacking with a person who has trample and it deals an additional damage, that could be the difference between your opponent losing life in that turn or it not, which is something that you should be thinking about. For a hypothetical example, I attack with my lizard that is 3/2 and has trample. You block with your 3/3. This then pushes in an additional damage, allowing us to trigger our lizard effects that turn, which I do think is the most viable implication to this, you know, proccing your abilities. So I'm going to give this a C+. Next up, we have our first red mythic. This is Dragonhawk Fate's Tempest. This is 3 red, and by the picture of this card, even before reading it, I have a feeling this is just going to be a bonkers card. Like, there's always that one big red flyer in these standard sets, like Bonehorde, Dracosaur, Sky Maw, Hellkite from Eldraine, that's always just broken. So I have high hopes for this. This is a legendary bird dragon 5/5 flyer. When this enters or attacks, exile the top cards of your library, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 4 or greater. You may play those cards until your next end step. At the beginning of your next end step, deal 2 damage to each opponent for each of those cards that are still exiled. Okay. So, if you attack with this, or it enters, you're going to, at minimum, look at the top card of your library. And if you're in the red-green deck, you're going to be able to potentially look at multiple cards and enable your expend. And then you can play those cards until your next end step. And then at the beginning of the next end step, you get to deal 2 damage to each opponent for each of those cards that are still exiled. Okay, that card's not as insane as I thought. I still think it's just good. I mean, 5/5 flying is just great. And the potential to either do additional damage to the opponent anytime this attacks and whenever it enters, or just play cards the turn after you played this. This card is an absurd card in the red-green space and, like, okay in the red-blue space. I think for the most part, I think you would probably want to avoid this if you have a premium deck that's red-white, because you don't really want to be playing 5 costs. You still could, and it would still be fine. I think within the red-white space, it's probably like a C+, maybe a C, just depending on what your curve is. Because I don't even think you want that many 4 drops in that archetype. I think you primarily want 2s, and then you probably want a couple 4s, and like if you have bombs at 3, that's fine. You know, like gold cards are cool, rares are cool. But yeah, so I think I'm going to give this card a B overall, because I do think the power level of this in the red-green strategy is pretty dang insane. Like, it's an infinite value engine, and it just lowers the amount of turns that you're clocking your opponent dead drastically in any deck. You only have to attack 4 times with this. If you're already at 5 mana, you've probably done around 5 damage, and including the additional 2 that I would assume you're going to deal the turn it plays, this is really a 3 to 2 turn clock, depending on when you played it. Next up, we have Season of the Bold, back at it again with another banger of a paw card. This is 3 red for a sorcery with 5 paws. You can choose multiple modes more than once. 1, you can create a tapped treasure. 2, exile the top 2 of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play them. And 3, until the end of your next turn, whenever you cast a spell, this deals 2 damage to up to 1 target creature. Okay. Now this one seems a lot more fair than the other ones we've seen. For the most part, the season cards we've seen with the pause have been relatively A level. I think this one is more segmented. I think the treasure mode is arguably just completely negligible, and I think it's probably the lowest impact out of any of the 1 paw modes we've seen on effects like this. And then the 2 and 3 just stand out to me to be things that I'm most interested in doing in the red-blue space. Especially because if I'm able to reduce the cost of this to 4 with either the red-blue gold card or the red class rare, it is drastically higher impact. And I know you could say that about anything, but that's the main archetype you're looking to play this. I guess that, like, in an aggro deck, maybe the 1 paw mode is more prevalent if you're going to be using the second ability, because 3 is probably less relevant to you, I would assume. So if you're exiling the top 4 and playing them until next turn, getting a tapped treasure might actually be relevant to you, because it could increase your likelihood of just playing all of the cards that you revealed off the top. Getting it tapped, though, does kind of suck, because then you can't play the cards immediately. I feel like that was just unnecessary, but maybe it's just like a commander nerf. So for 3, it's not when you cast a non-creature. It's any spell. So I guess that does make level 3 more relevant to aggro. I don't know. It kind of conflicts because it's like, okay, level 3 seems like it would be good to just spam out 1s and 2s on the following turn and kill my opponent. But at the same time, there's just so many things to be doing with your mana. Like, I could just throw out 1s and 2s on the same turn I did that, you know? And they relatively don't care as much about the tap treasure. I think this one is probably going to be a B- because you're mostly interested in this in the red-blue deck, especially because level 3 can only deal damage to a creature, which means that, like, the aggressive decks, they're already pretty good at pushing through damage. So I feel like you don't really want that as much. Like, it still could be beneficial if you're going against another aggro person. They have, like, low statted bodies in general. But I think for the most part, red-blue is getting the most, like, versatility and optionality out of this. And I think in that deck, it's probably just like a B-. I mean, I guess, yeah, I think I'm going to go with B-. The one thing that is somewhat interesting about this card is the 3-paw mode does allow you to target any creature, which means if you do have a buffed up mice card, it can trigger your Valiant, which could maybe allow you to trigger like a couple people's Valiant, but dealing 2 damage to them makes them bad attackers for that turn. So the implications in red-white, I will be very interested to see how they play out, because I feel like this card interacts with that deck in a way different way than it does for the red-blue deck. How interested is the red-green deck in this? I mean, I think it's just, they're just interested in that because it's a 5-costed card, so it triggers your expend. And I think when you think about this card like this is one of those cards that provides high impact, but does not immediately advance your game state, nor does it, like, provide you any tempo the turn that you play it. So maybe the red-green deck is very interested in this if your deck is very heavy into expend, because potentially if this procs multiple expend triggers, maybe that would mitigate some of the tempo lost for you paying 5 mana to essentially do nothing the turn that this is played. That will be very interesting, and I think this is one of the ones that I'm probably going to get completely wrong. So I'm going to go with B- here. Remember to clip this and come back and look at how wrong I was about this card. All right, next up we have Storm Splitter. This is 3 and a red for a 1/4 otter with haste. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, create a token that is a copy of Storm Splitter. Exile that token at the beginning of the next end step. So, how good is this really? This is a weird card, and I think 4 is a lot. Because realistically, the turn you play this, you're not playing another instant or sorcery, which I'm very skeptical at this point with the power creep in Magic, the power creep in a lot of games. Pretty much what you're looking for in a good card in general, not just draft, is my card needs to provide me immediate upfront value, or it's not probably going to be as good as some of the other cards. Because the deal is, if you play this and you just attack for 1 and you spent 4 mana, then the opponent kills this, and then you get no value because you didn't get to like copy this, even one time before it died. That's such a negative exchange of value in your favor, which tells me that this card is very finicky, and it might just be the most niche mythic rare we have seen thus far. Because I don't even think this is good and constructed. I kind of wish this was 3, and honestly, I would be fine if they took like a toughness decrease on it to do that, because then you would have a higher likelihood of maybe being able to do this, and then playing a spell in the same turn, like more so than you are right now. So the one interesting thing about this card is if you play this and then on the following turn, you're able to cast 3 spells, you will create the token. Then you will create 2 tokens, right? And then at that point, you're going to create another 3 tokens. So that's like 6 damage if you could play 3 spells, which is kind of cool. I think I kind of need to have something like, if my deck has a lot of the blue card that I think is 3, and the cost is reduced by 1 per otter I control, or maybe it's just 1 otter. I'm not really sure. I think it's per otter. And I think if that card does what I think it does, and you can pay 1 mana to draw 2 cards, and you have like 2 or 3 of those, this probably increases in value, because you realistically need to be able to do like, ideally triple spells on the following turn you play this for it to be good, which tells me this is probably just a C-level card, because you do have to build around it, but there is potential upside to doing that, and especially if you get like a instant or sorcery that's a full AoE buff, that could be game ending, but you have to do a lot of work to make that up, and it's only one deck is really interested in this, so I'm just going to go with C, maybe C minus. All right, now moving on to the bonus sheet here, we have Kindred Charge. This is 4 and double red for a sorcery. Choose a creature type for each creature you control of that type. Create a token that's a copy of that creature. Those tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. Okay. So this card is best put in red-white or red-black, because those are the decks where you want all the creatures the same type, obviously, and then you're going to have a bunch of low-to-the-ground guys, you're spamming the board, and then you're going to get in for a lot of damage. It does not target, though, because it says the word choose. Yeah, it just says for each, so you don't get Valiant, and it costs 6. I don't think this is going to be very good, because the decks that want this aren't interested in paying 6 mana, because there are already full AoE buffs that could potentially do equal or more amount of additional damage than this could at like 3 mana. And this is also double red, so I have a feeling this is a D- level card. You would prefer not to play this, but I guess there might be some situations where it allows you to kill someone. So I'm not saying it's completely useless. It's just the decks that most benefit from this are not really interested in paying 6 mana. Okay, and that's going And that's going to wrap up red. So we're going to move on to, I believe, black, which is our final color. And then we're going to move on to multicolors and then colorless cards. So far, what colors do you guys think are the best? So far, I feel like white is just indefinitely the best color. And then after white, maybe red. Red is powerful creatures, but the removal is medium. Maybe blue, actually. I kind of just like blue. I feel like blue just goes in like a lot of different places, and so does white. But I also am just extremely biased by the aspect of me just thinking at face value that red, white mice is automatically the best deck without having any experience playing with the cards. And it's just because like the game plan seems easy. All of the cards are so synergistic. And at face value, Valiant just seems like the most unfair keyword. Like, Valiant is just kind of broken because they've created so many ways to where Valiant triggers, like, without you having to spend mana, which, in my opinion, is really stupid. Pulling up the black cards here, baby. Only 8 rares for black. Interesting. Do they get a lot of mythics? Oh, they get 3 mythics. Okay. Okay, they get 2 special guests. That's fine. They get 2 special guests. Okay. And then let me go ahead and pull up the multicolors while I'm at it. We love a good multicolor rare this time of year, eh? Honestly, this is a question I've been wondering for a while. How do you guys feel about there only being 1 planeswalker per set? I feel like it makes it like inherently just kind of like less enjoyable because for me personally, it's like, okay, if there's only going to be 1 planeswalker per set, that means there's like a high amount of pressure on Wizards to make that planeswalker at least somewhat viable since there's only 1 per set. And because of that, it feels like the person who is able to draft the 1 planeswalker is just at an inherent advantage because they just have a value engine that other people just don't come close to. And a lot of the removal, unless it's premium, does not interact with planeswalkers on average, just creatures, which makes it more irritating. So I feel like, honestly, if they are going to like continue that strategy, it would be best for the community for all removal that targets creatures to also target planeswalkers. But that's just my opinion. I'm interested what you guys have to say about it. Now, let me go to the bathroom real quick before we start this. All right, we are back, boys. Shout out to everyone who's gotten this far in the video and listened to me talk about how every magic card is ass. I had to change into shorts real quick because it's literally like 99 degrees outside. Absolutely insane. All right, moving on to our first black card, we have Coiling Rebirth. This is 3 and 2 black. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Then if you gift your opponent a card and that creature isn't legendary, you can create a token that is a copy except it is 1/1. So very interesting. I have to say at first glance, this is an overcosted ability, but if you are reviving a bomb, once again, this is a card that's just better if you have like a premium card, then giving the opponent a card is way more valuable. And I think that's a trend we're seeing with these gift a card type of effects. Realistically, in order to like justify gifting my opponent a card, I'm looking to have done something that interacts, like buys back my bomb, lets me reuse my bomb, whatever you want to say. And this card does provide that optionality. I think just reviving it and not getting the 1/1 token is still fine. It does not have a finality counter on the card you revive, which is okay. And we saw an effect like this in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and it was a C+ level effect. And you didn't have the option to be able to gift a card. I think it was in the green-black deck, which turned out to be pretty good. This time around, it's going to be facilitated within the blue-black deck. But once again, I think if you have a good enough thing to be reviving, then this card is actually really great. Arguably better than this effect was in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, because the Threshold deck is very good at milling. I would say rather better than green-black was in Ixalan, and green-black was already pretty decent at that, which tells me that this is probably going to be a C+ card within those decks. Obviously, it is a build-around, but I think just because of the potential behind it and not getting a finality counter, so maybe you can reuse the bomb some other way, I'm going to give this card a C+ for synergy. All right, next up we have Cruel Claw's Heist. This is double black, target opponent for a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, choose a non-land card from it, exile that card, and if you gift your opponent a card, you may cast that card as long as it remains exiled, and mana of any type can be spent to cast it. So obviously, like, a lot of people have been talking about this for Constructed, and I think the consensus is that paying 2 mana for it is really bad, especially double black. I think this card might have had implications in like Standard if it was 1 black, 1 colorless, but the double black really hurts that, and I think it hurts it here too. If you're a primarily all black deck, I think part of the time you might be willing to pay for a 2 mana Thoughtseize. I know that like in formats, oftentimes the what is the version of Thoughtseize called where you can't target creatures? I forget what that's called, but that normally costs 1 mana, and that's usually like okay. It's usually like a C, which leads me to believe this is probably a D+ card because the effect isn't super impactful. It's not bad, but then you also require double black. I think gifting the card is pretty negligible. because that would be best in a simplified game state where you have a lot of mana to spend. But if you're doing that in a game state like it, and if you're doing that in a game state such as a simplified one, where you're in a top deck war, if the opponent only has one card in hand, there's a 50-50 chance it's just a land and they're baiting. Because if they were able to play that card, it wouldn't, be put onto the battlefield. And if they have no cards and you're gifting a card, then that means that you are paying 2 mana to exile a random card from the top of their deck and be able to potentially play it, which just seems bad. So I think this is just a D-level card. Probably one to avoid it, but if your mana base is good, maybe you could bring it in from the sideboard. If you know your opponent has a bomb and your mana base is good, we're putting that in from the sideboard. That's where I'm going to stand on that. This is a sideboard exclusive card. D- D in the main deck. Next up, we have Darkstar Augur. This is 2 and a black for a 2/3 Bat Warlock with Offspring of 1 black to create a 1/1 copy. With flying, at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library, put that card into your hand, and lose life equal to its mana value. Wow, this is really good. I legitimately think this card might have constructed implications, because if you guys played in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which I did not, I, about a month ago, saw what Caustic Bronco did. It's the 2-drop that whenever it attacks, you add the top card of your deck to your hand and lose life. So it's the same effect, but it's when you attack. I thought that card was terrible. But apparently that card's pretty good in Standard, which tells me a similar effect that also allows you to replicate it for only an additional mana is probably also going to be pretty good in Standard. And it is a bat, and the 1/1 will have flying. So just paying 1 to create a 1/1 flyer, even without the secondary effect, is fine. But the fact that you do get the secondary effect makes me think that's really good. I think the bat deck is obviously most interested in this. But honestly, I think that the Threshold deck could be relatively interested in this too. And as well the green-black deck. So I think this is just overall a solid card. It does have that risk associated with it where you could deck out or you could just die to losing all of your life. But I think it's good enough, even if you didn't have Offspring on it, that it'd probably still pretty solid. I'm going to go ahead and take a guess here and say this is going to be a B-, because I do think this card can go in pretty much any deck and you're not dissatisfied with it. It's also a decent first pick. And the added optionality of creating another 1/1 could be pretty good. If your deck's already relatively aggressive, you losing life and you decking out probably won't come up. Because you're creating 2 bodies in the air for 4 mana. And you're drawing cards, so I think it'll help you contribute to killing your opponent if your deck is just naturally faster than them. If you're playing in control and you're playing aggro, it might just be better. So very interesting card. I'm actually excited to see where this shapes up, but I'm going to go B-. Oh, and I do want to mention that this makes you lose life at the beginning of your upkeep, which is actually pretty relevant because there are multiple cards that say if you lost life during your turn, you can immediately get value from them, rather than some of the other cards that say you lose or your opponent loses life at the end phase. That is better. So this card might actually be better than I originally proposed it was. Our next card is Iridescent Vine Lasher. This is 1 black for a 1/2 lizard, Offspring 2 to create a copy with landfall. When a land enters, this creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. That just seems great. I think this legitimately might just be the best rare that we have seen thus far, and maybe the best rare in the set for the lizard deck. Landfall being able to deal your opponent a damage is insane. Because playing lands is inherently a thing you already want to do. especially in a deck where it's relatively important to be curving out, being able to just guarantee that trigger from your opponent's life loss every turn for free is crazy in the Lizard deck. And you have the optionality to times that by 2. So I think it's more relevant that you're creating 2 bodies with this effect to where if your opponent has a removal, they have to answer 2 things instead of 1, than it is for the damage to be stacking. Because more important than the damage being dealt, it's just turning on your other cards. This turns on your entire engine, which seems insane. And I think maybe you might be okay with this in another black deck. Like, you might be okay with this in the green black deck because maybe the damage is just important to you if you're like a low-costed deck trying to play aggressive. In any other aggressive black deck, you're probably still pretty happy with this. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this is A- in the Lizard deck. And then if there's another deck that wants this, it's probably just a B-. But it's the fact that it's just a guaranteed way on turn 1 of the game to start dealing damage to your opponent that puts it over the top for me. Because we haven't seen a lot of cards within the Lizard space that allow you to start making your opponent lose life for free on the first turn of the game. This might be the only one. And for that reason, I think this is just such a big signal that you should be going into Lizards. Like, I know this isn't a great comparison, but the impact on the deck archetype being Lizards this has reminds me of the impact Guide of Souls had in MH3 on the energy deck drafts. Like, just getting energy on turn 1 in the red-white energy decks was insane, which leads me to believe that this is equally as insane in comparison to, the power level of this format. Next up, we have Osteomancer Adept. This is 1 in a black for a 2/2 squirrel, Death Touch. Tap it. Until the end of your turn, you may cast creature spells from your graveyard by foraging in addition to paying their costs. If you cast a spell this way, that creature enters with a finality counter on it, meaning that whenever it would die, it'd be exiled instead. Wow. This card's great. I think this card is absolutely amazing. And I also think there's a lot of overlap in this in the foraging green-black deck, as well as the Threshold deck. Because I feel like Threshold innately, although they want to get to 7 cards in grave, they also just have really good creatures that they want to get back. And cards that, just have effects in the graveyard. And in those Threshold decks, there is a risk that you're going to mill one of your bombs. And this can buy back a bomb. If you're reviving a bomb and it mitigates your Threshold for a turn, you're probably just fine with that. And then it's also just a 2/2 Death Touch, which is statted really well. I'm going to go ahead and say this is a B+. Because it overlaps into multiple decks, and the stats and keywords you're getting at minimum are already just amazing. Yeah, I really, really like this card. I think this is a solid B+. It's just good everywhere and insane in the Forge deck. And honestly, a card that I'm really happy to see, because I already rated the 5-mana revive a creature from the 5-mana revive a creature from the graveyard spell fairly highly at C+. Well, this does that at 2 mana. And all you have to do is, exile other cards from the graveyard or sack a food. It's not even any additional mana. And it's repeatable, which makes it absurd. Next up, we have another class card. This is Scavenger's Talent. It is 1 black. At level 1, when 1 or more creatures die you control, create a food token. This triggers only once each turn. Okay, so for 1 mana, I'm automatically getting a infinite value engine for generating food, which is something that the green-blacks already care about quite a bit. I feel like once you've generated 2 food, This card has already paid for itself. At level 2 for 1 and a black, when you sacrifice a permanent, target player mills 2 cards. That's awesome. So if I sack a food that was created by this, I can mill 2 more cards to facilitate a forage, or mill 2 cards to be able to revive something back from the graveyard because I have like a buyback, or I have that rare that lets you revive cards. And at level 3 for 2 and a black, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice 3 other non-land permanents, and if you do, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Wow. This card is insane. Wow. This card is just broken. It's like, these effects are already super impactful, but I wouldn't even be mad if level 3 costed 4 mana. But the fact that level 2 only costs 2 mana, and then level 3 only costs 3 mana, that's great. I see this card, I want to go into the green-black food deck. And honestly, if you have overlap between creating foods and you're in the threshold deck, you're probably pretty happy with this as well, just because being able to revive things from the graveyard in that deck is pretty relevant. Especially if you're like creating a lot of permanents, because this could turn on your threshold. Like, if you have, 6 cards in graveyard and you're reviving a creature, but you're putting 3 things into the graveyard, that could give you threshold. So there is some overlap there. I think overall, even if you're not going to level 3, the card's just good for multiple reasons. Since it's such a low upfront cost, I'm going to give this a B+, because this is a card I'm excited to open, and I don't really have to do a lot of work to build around. I kind of just need to be in the colors and the space where you're wanting an effect like this. Next up, we have Valley Rotcaller. 1 and a black for a 1/3 squirrel with menace. Whenever this attacks, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of other squirrels, bats, lizards, and rats you control. Okay. So I get to drain my opponent, which I don't think squirrel decks are the most interested in. Because I feel like in squirrels, from what I understand, I could be wrong, it's more of a mid-range deck. Which makes me feel like you're not going to be like going wide as much as some of the other aggressive decks like mice or lizards. But this deck card does just count all creature types, so even if you don't have all squirrels, it's probably still worth putting in. And then the menace is just great. Because in the early game, you're going to be attacking with this, and your opponent just blocks it for free. Your guy doesn't die, their guy doesn't die, and you're still just draining. But I think this is probably most relevant in lizards, because it's just a good way to make your opponent lose life. Even if they have a blocker, it has menace, which is just great. Oh, I honestly just misread the part where it had menace. That's absurd. Yeah, I think honestly, no one is dissatisfied playing this. As long as you have somewhat of an interest to go wide. But bats and lizards are very happy with this card. I think more so lizards than bats. But it does help out your bat effects. It is also a card that some of your flyers in white buff people on the ground. And maybe this is one of the better cards you can be buffing on the ground because it does start with menace. And it does buff up your cards that trigger when you gain life. So I think this card is really good. I'm going to give this a build around B. Primarily for the synergy in the bats and lizards deck, but I do think that other decks are happy to play this as well, as long as you're somewhat interested in, going wide. Next up, we have Wick, the World Mind. This is 3 and a black for a rat legendary creature, 2/4. Whenever this or another rat enters, create a 1/1 black snail. If you don't control a snail, Otherwise, put a 1/1 counter on a snail you control. So that's kind of similar to that zombie mechanic, Amass. Or yeah, you get orcs. Yeah, orc was the Amass thing. So that's kind of similar in that way. And then for a blue, black, and red, sack a snail. Deal damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to each opponent. Then draw cards equal to the number of creatures sacrificed. Draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Okay. So by paying a blue, black, and red and sacking a token, you're dealing damage equal to the size of that token and drawing an equivalent amount of cards. Now, I don't know that you're going to be able to consistently get that ability off. But, I mean, in Rats, you're already relatively interested in this for, like, the infinite value generation to just keep growing something. Which I do think is just already good on its own. I think I think most possibly, you're going to, in order to trigger this, in order to trigger the 3-color ability most consistently, it's probably going to be you playing blue-black because that's already Rats. And then you throw in like a mountain for the chance for you to be able to get that ability if your mana base is already just good. Because, I mean, why not? Like, that's great. But you don't need that ability for this card to be great. It is 4 cost, though. Which, like, at that point, you might have already thrown out a couple of the Rats in your hand. So I don't know how many, like, depending on how aggressive that deck is, you might not be getting snails as quickly, but I don't think that really matters. Like, you're getting this, the first snail immediately. So that means you're getting 4 mana for a 3/5 with the potential to grow that creature or sack it and just keep making another one. Which does just have inherent synergies. So I think I'm going to give this a build around B-, because you do need to be very rat focused. But I do really like this card, and the additional ability is very interesting. I will be very interested in seeing how likely it is for you to actually use that ability. Because if you can fairly consistently, like, get that ability off through, like, mana fixing and stuff, or the mana bases for these decks are already just really good, the card becomes even better. But let's go with build around B- for now. All right, that was our last black rare. We're going to be moving on to the mythics. Our first one up is Maha. It's the Feathers. It's Feathers Knight. 3 double black for a 6/5 legendary creature elemental, flying trample, ward, discard a card. Creatures your opponent control have base toughness 1. I mean, its wingspan reaches from dusk to dawn. It's obviously a bomb, guys. This is probably one of the most irritating cards to play against in the format. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this is an A+. In a standard set, I think this card is so powerful to where it will see some play as a finisher in Constructed. And for the same reason, I think just what you're getting for the amount of mana you're paying is absurd. And you don't even have to have AoEs to make this good. I do really like that it has Trample. Considering I've stated how many cards in this format have Reach, the Trample is super, super relevant. And I think it kind of pushes this card above the rest. So I'm going to say this is an A+ card. This might be the first A+ card that we've seen. And this is a card you want to play in any black deck. But the controlling black decks, you know, mainly blue-black, to some extent green-black, those are going to be the ones most interested in this. Because blue-black is the deck that can revive this from the graveyard. So they're going to be able to see it more often than other people. And that's a slower deck. Because really what I see about this card is that when you make all of their creatures toughness 1, I'm not expecting to be able to get an AoE and wombo combo them. I'm expecting them to just not be able to attack with any of their creatures. Because this has flying, it has 5 toughness, and it has a word cost that's justifiably hefty, especially in a simplified game state, to where I think it just invalidates all of your opponent's attacks. So if you have some kind of value engine and something to just continuously use your mana on in the late game, it's kind of just like an immovable object for your opponent, which is just unfair. So A+ for Maha. All right, next up we have Rotten Mouth Viper. This is 5 and a black for an elemental 6/6. As an additional cost to cast this, you may sacrifice any number of non-land permanents, and this will cost 1 less for each permanent sacrificed this way. When this enters or attacks, put a blight counter on it. Then for each blight counter on it, each opponent loses 4 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or discards a card. So I think people call this kind of effect a Punisher effect, and I'm usually not very excited about that. But the way this is situated, I am really, really happy about that. Because this is an auto kill on sight. When this enters and you get the first blight counter, you're probably not going to get the result out of your opponent's choosing that you would like. But after you attack 1 time, you're going to get at least something that you liked about that interaction. Because it just keeps doubling. So the first time they discard a land, second time it's like, oh, they might have to discard a real card and lose 4 life. And this guy's 6/6, so you're pressuring. He seems like he has good synergies with the Threshold deck because you can put cards into the graveyard and reduce this guy's cost. Honestly, if you're paying 5 for this, you're very happy. That's great. And if you're paying even less for this, even more great. And another thing to note about this card, it says sacrifice any number of non-lands. That doesn't mean you can't sacrifice tokens. So what that also means is we can sacrifice foods and potentially get other triggers off of cards that work with sacrificing foods. So I think once again, this card is just really good in the green-black and the blue-black deck. I mean, because you can reduce the cost, maybe there's an argument that it's also good in the Lizard deck. Because I guess, if you get into the late game and your opponent, not even just the late game, even in the mid game, your opponent's creatures are just better than yours, you might as well sacrifice them to put this out. Because this could make them start losing life, which then just inherently makes your Lizards better. Now, I don't know how relevant that is, because I don't know exactly how that deck is looking to play. Maybe, you just don't want to be sacking, stuff like that. But overall, it just feels like each color pair has at least some innate advantage to putting this card in the deck. It just makes your deck better every time. Outside of, birds, or I mean bats, right? Because bats care about life. This doesn't give you life, but it's just a good card. So you're probably fine playing it in those decks anyway, especially if you have some of the white cards that care about targeting a non-flyer. If you have a flyer that gives this flying or gives this menace or 1/1, that's great. That's so good. So I think this is just an A overall, with build-around potential to make it even better. Wow, black has 2 really powerful mythics. All right, now we are on to the season for black. These are the paw cards. This is Season of Loss. 3 and double black for a sorcery. You get 5 paws, and you can choose each mode more than once. For 1, each player sacks a creature. For 2, draw a card for each creature you control that died this turn. And 3, each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Wow, that's scary. Can you imagine playing a Threshold deck and paying 5 mana to just kill the other person because you're doing 10 damage? I don't know how often that will occur, but it sounds really broken. Because as we saw the blue X spell could let you mill like up to 8 cards maybe. You know, and you're milling 8 cards, you get all these creatures in the grave and you just do this and it's like, could just be game. Wow, I'm really liking the potential of this Threshold deck. At the least, the Threshold deck seems really fun and intricate to figure out. So my question is, I think with these modular cards, I'm pretty sure, do you resolve all the effects at once, or do they resolve in descending order? Because I think the way that modular effects work is they go in descending order. So if you use the one paw mode 3 times, sack 3 creatures, then you would get to draw a card for each of those that were sacked. I'm pretty sure that that's the way that works, right? I'm not exactly sure, but I don't think that's integral to making this good. Regardless, I think this card is just good and easily just could be a win condition in your Threshold deck. Maybe even in the green-black Forge deck. This is definitely a card for the controlling black decks. So I don't think Lizards will be interested in all. But in the controlling decks, especially Threshold, I think this is a B+ build around. Alright, moving on to the bonus sheet for black. We have a reprint of Rat Colony in a really saucy art. This is a 2/1 rat, and Rat Colony gets +1/0 for each other rat you control, and a deck can have any number of cards named Rat Colony, but it's very unlikely. I honestly, if you told me you drafted a deck with 2 Rat Colony, I wouldn't believe you. Because, like, there is still cards. I'm like almost 100 drafts in from MH3, and there is still some cards on the bonus sheet I've never opened in an actual pack, and I have never seen in a draft. Which tells me that's just an irrelevant fact, but I think that's just kind of funny to bring up. Like, if you see someone who has 2 Rat Colony, I advise you to call the judge or press the report a bug within Magic Arena. Be like, I thought this was the special guest sheet, not the special guest sheet. Why does my opponent have 2 Rat Colony? So how good is this? I guess if you have 1 rat, it's a 2-mana 3/1. If you have multiple rats, it's a 2-mana 4/1. I mean, I guess it's a 2-mana 2/1 that grows after every turn, which is kind of good. I think it just depends on how wide can your rat deck go. It seems like sometimes your rat deck won't be that wide because it's more of a controlling deck, which tells me this is probably just like a solid card in the rat deck and no one else wants it. And considering it's not a Lord effect, it doesn't give the other rats buffs, it just gives him buffs. I'm going to go with a C+ card. Next up, we have Relentless Rats. This is 1 and 2 black for a 2/2 rat. Relentless Rats gets +1/+1 for each other creature on the battlefield named Relentless Rats. Once again, another fucking irrelevant effect. A deck can have any number of cards named Relentless Rats. Dude, why is this even in the set?
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
I thought that it was kind of a waste to even put Rat Colony in this set. But putting Relentless Rats, I mean, this is just an F. Like, this is a 3-mana 2/2. Do not play this card. That is honestly, like, 2 of the most, like, worst usable slots that I've ever seen in any set. These cards should either be for Commander, or they shouldn't be in play boosters. Just make them only available within the premium boosters that aren't used for draft. All right, that's going to be it for the black cards. We're now going to move on to the multicolor, rare, and mythics. So this is a red-blue rare. It is Alania Divergent Storm. 3 and a blue and a red for a 3/5 otter. Whenever you, and it's a legendary creature, whenever you cast a spell, if it's the first instant spell, the first sorcery, or the first otter spell other than Alania you've cast this turn, you may have target opponent draw a card. If you do copy that spell, you may choose new targets for that copy. Wow. They worded this card so freaking poorly. They easily could have just said, whenever you cast your first spell this turn, that is that. But they repeated the same statement over and over again. L Wizards. But this card seems pretty good. This card does indeed seem pretty good. So I can give you a card to copy my card, which might just be game ending. Like, and it's not just instant or sorcery. The fact it's also otters is kind of broken. Because it's like, okay, well, if I'm playing the red-blue deck, if I have a good deck, 99% of my creatures are going to be all otters anyway, which means it's just the first spell I cast each turn that's not an artifact or enchantment, which is fine. That just seems great. Like, 5 mana, 3/5. It has a solid body. It's also just an otter. And then there are plenty of strong, like, I know this is very rare to happen, but if you have, like, the blue season or the red season, you're like, I'm going to give you a card. I mean, I'm going to draw, like, 10 cards. That's just unfair. Yeah, this card seems great. I'm very excited to play with this card. It's very fun, but it's also very fair. Like, it costs 5 mana, takes time to get started, and then you have to give your opponent a card. Like, this is a fine instant of the gift mechanic. It's funny they didn't actually use the word gift, though. But overall, a very cool card, and I'm excited for it. I'm going to give this a build around B-. Because you do have to have good things to, like, be interacting with this. It's exclusive to one deck, and, you know, you may not have those things. You do have to do work. I know most Americans don't, like, from this generation, especially the Arena Zoomers, don't like to have to do work. But this card is worth it, trust me. All right, our next card is Balin the Haymaker. This is red, green, and a white for a 4/3 rabbit. Tap 2 untapped tokens you control to add 1 mana of any color. Tap 3 untapped tokens to draw a card. Tap 4 untapped tokens to put 3 1/1 counters on Balin. It gains trample until end of turn. Wow, this card is really bad. Honestly, I don't even know if this is really good for you in Commander. I don't even think I would play this in Commander. Like, it's kind of a cool card, but let's just be real. This is a Commander exclusive card. This is an F. Not only because green-white, like, you're not splashing a red to put this in your deck. The amount of things you have to tap to be able to, like, use the value of this card is so negligible. Like, you're tapping 2 tokens to make 1 mana. That's so bad. If you're playing a token deck, like, you already don't want to be splashing like that. I guess the only benefit of this card is that it allows you to build a commander deck around rabbits or tokens, which I don't know how many of those there are, like, outside of green, white in general from previous sets, like the rabbits. But I guess it lets you go into 3 colors. I'm going to give this an F. I just think it's, like, a terrible rate for what you're getting. And the aggro decks don't want to be splashing. All right, our next card is Camellia, the Seed Miser. It is 1 and a green and a black for a 3/3 squirrel. It has menace. Other squirrels have menace. Holy shit, that's broken. Whenever you sacrifice 1 or more foods, create a 1/1 squirrel creature token. Holy shit, that's broken. For 2, you can forage to put a 1/1 counter on each other squirrel you control. Holy shit, that's broken. So you're telling me that I am spending 3 mana for a 3/3 menace. I'm already like, okay, I'm happy with that. That's fine. Then I can pay 2 to forage, sacrificing my food. Then on the stack, I will get to create a 1/1 squirrel token put a 1/1 counter on it and all other squirrels I control? This card is insane. This card is insane. I'm not going to lie. I think this might be the best rare for squirrels we've seen so far. It might just be the best rare for squirrels in the entire set. And it is a win condition. It is a value engine that fuels itself. And just giving all your other stuff menace while also AoE buffing them, that's ridiculous. I might be too biased towards this deck. I'm going to give this a build around A-. I know that it's only good in one deck, but it's good in all situations in that deck. It allows you to end the game. It allows you to have a value engine. And it just gives all your stuff that you want to have in the deck menace for free. And at worst, it's just 3/3 menace with potential upside. Yeah, this card is insane. That might be my favorite gold card so far. Next up, we have Clement, the Worrywart. This is 1, a green, and a blue for a 3/3 frog legendary creature. Vigilance, whenever Clement the Worrywart or another creature you control enters, return up to 1 target creature you control with lesser mana value to its owner's hand. Frogs you control have tap to add a green or a blue, but spend this mana only to cast a creature spell. Wow, the artwork on this card is really cool. Honestly, I'm a big fan of this card. So it gives you a value engine to keep blinking things. And it's 3/3 Vigilance, which isn't bad. I will, and like your frogs just turn into mana dorks. That's great. Like, it facilitates itself. Because like, okay, you don't only use the mana to cast creatures. But what I can do is, let's say I have the 2 mana green, blue, gold card. That says you get to draw a card when a creature, leaves the battlefield and re-enters. Or no, it just says you draw a card whenever it enters. So if you have that into this, you can now tap that card for a mana immediately, use it to play a creature that's higher costed, bounce it back to hand, and then draw a card again. Like, that's great. I'm going to go ahead and give this a build around B-. I know only one deck's interested in it, but it is a card that makes me want to go into green-blue. And I think it's very well situated with what green-blue is trying to do overall. My thing about green-blue is it looks really fun, but it seems very contingent on you opening the cards that give you bonuses for blinking things, because I think there's like a decent amount of stuff that lets you blink, but it seems like the cards that give you bonuses when something does blink are very important. All right, our next card is another Simic card. It is Dreamdew Entrancer. It is 2 and a green and a blue for a 3/4 frog with reach. Whenever it enters, tap up to 1 target creature and put 3 stun counters on it. If you control that creature, draw 2 cards. Wow. This card is great. This card is really great. So I'm paying 4 mana for a 3/4 reach. I can target a creature my opponent controls, just put 3 stun counters on it. So I'm paying 1 more mana than a Frost Lynx, but I'm getting 2 more stun counters. And my card gets reach and better stats for what I'm paying. Or, more relevant, I can target my own guy. And if we saw, like, what we were doing with Clement the Worrywart, that's kind of an innate combo. So if you play this, and you already have Clement on the board, what you can do is you can put this on the stack, cause it to trigger before Clement, and then you can put the stun counters on your lower costed card, draw 2 cards, then bounce it back to hand with Clement on the stack. Wow, that is a really cool interaction. And I think that interaction might actually make me interested in building a Commander deck, which is hilarious because, like, I don't play Commander. Wow, that's really cool. Plus, this guy just kind of reminds me, like, I like cards like this and Psychic Frog from MH3 because they kind of just remind me of Hypno Frog from Futurama. Yeah, I don't think this card's bad by any means. Like, even if you don't have other support for it, it's just good. I'm going to give this a build around A-. It's just too good. All right, next up we have Phineas, Ace Archer. This is 1 green, 1 white for a 2/2 legendary rabbit with vigilance and reach. 2/2 vigilance reach. I'm already in. Whenever this attacks, put a 1/1 counter on each other creature you control that is a token or a rabbit. Then if creatures you control have total power 10 or greater, draw a card. Wow, this card does so much for you at such a little cost, has such high immediate impact. 2 mana 2/2 vigilance reach would already be a pretty good card. The fact you have this other ability, which is essentially like an infinite value engine and a way to end the game, I'm down. This is a solid synergy B+. Like, I see this card, I'm doing the thing. This can end games. It can give me card advantage. At worst, it's a 2/2 vigilance reach. Maybe I get more upside. This card is insane. Next up, we have Gev Scaled Scorch. This is a black and a red for a legendary lizard. 3/2 ward, your opponent must pay 2 life. Other creatures you control enter with an additional 1/1 counter on them for each opponent who has lost life this turn. Whenever you cast a lizard spell, this deals 1 damage to target opponent. Holy shit. I thought that 1-drop lizard guy with Offspring was the best lizard enabler in the format. Maybe this guy's just better. Well, no, that guy was Landfall. It's probably more likely that you're going to be... It's probably more likely you're going to be landfalling than you are playing a creature. But at the same time, when you think about it like this, why do I want to deal damage to my opponent? So that I can trigger the effect of my lizard creature. Well, I need to put that lizard creature on the battlefield anyway. So getting to do a damage for free is absurd. And then after the first one that you play, like, you're just getting it to enter with an additional 1/1. This card's crazy. Yeah, I think this is just a build around B+. And then the Ward 2 is so nice because you only need to get value out of this like 1 time for it to be absurd. Anything else after that is icing on the cake. So adding a ward cost is actually so beneficial. Because at worst, the ward cost is actually insane for this deck. I was thinking it was like kind of irritating, but it's like, no, I'm putting this on the battlefield so that I can trigger my lizard effects. If my opponent wants to remove it, they inherently just trigger my lizard effects for that turn. That's so crazy. Yeah, this is a build around B+ all day. That card's insane. I love the way they structured it, but lizard seems kind of OP if you have this. Wow, this seems like a really bomby set. Our next card is Castrel, the Wind Crested. This is 3 white blue for a 4/5 legendary bird with flying. Whenever 1 or more birds you control deal combat damage to a player, you may put a bird creature card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield with a finality counter, or put a 1/1 counter on each bird you control, or draw a card. Wow, this card's great too. It is higher costed than the other bombs we have seen thus far, but this set is looking up to be a print set as fuck. Like, this set feels like pick your rare, build around it, hope that you have more rares than your opponent. Like, it almost feels like OTJ in a way. Like, this card is crazy. Like, all of the dual cards we've seen are absurd build arounds. I think this is another easy B+ build around. The fact that the card you're putting from the graveyard or hand in the battlefield does not come into play tapped is so huge. Because once you do that, it's just facilitating you to be able to have more people to keep triggering this ability every turn. And it also just helps build up the 1/1 counter ability. And it's just crazy. Like, I thought the 5 mana Bluebird that creates you a 1/1 token on the ground every time you play a bird was insane. Or a flyer, but this card's just way better than that. So this card has to be a B+ minimum. All right, almost done here. We've got Lunar Convocation. This is a white and a black enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, each opponent loses 1. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained and lost life this turn, create a 1/1 bat creature with flying, and then you can pay 1 and a black, pay 2 life, draw a card. I think this card is good. Now, I think this card is entirely contingent on your ability to be able to gain and lose life, which makes me like a little bit skeptical because you have to have moving parts there. But it is just 2 mana to pay 2 life, draw a card, and you know, if you're able to gain, then that means that you can trigger the ability to keep getting bats. Like, that's just great. And then the bat that you're getting has flying, which means you can create more triggers for this. And this is just an infinite value engine. And once you're set up in bats, it just kind of lets you just steal the game. At a cost of 2, I think I'm in for this every time. I think this is probably a B- build around because you do have to do work, but it is very powerful if you do the work. Very strong payoff. Next up, we have Mabel, Heir to Cragflame. This is 1 red and white for a legendary mouse. For 3/3, other mice you control get +1/+1. Okay, 3 mana for a 3/3 lord on rate, or I'm already in. When this enters, create a Cragflame legendary colorless equipment with equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has vigilance, trample, and haste and equip 2. Wow. This card's absurd. Like, the red-white deck did not need any more help. But what's really broken about this card is it's like, okay, it's a lord. So it's already a kill on sight. But at best, my opponent trades 1 for 1 with this, and I get an equipment that I can pay 2 to equip, and my creature gets +1/+1 vigilance and trample. That's absurd. Yeah, I think this is like, you don't even need to build around. Like, you're just in the red-white space. This is just absurd. I think this is another B+. It might even be an A-, just because the red-white deck seems so strong, and they just have so many things that work together. And it's an equipment so it can target your guys. It triggers your Valiant. I didn't even think about that immediately. Yeah, this might just be an A- because it does trigger Valiant. Next up, we have Muera, Trash Tactician. This is 1, a red and a green for a legendary raccoon, 2/4. At the beginning of your first main phase, add red or green for each raccoon you control. When you expend 4, gain 3 life. When you expend 8, exile the top 2 of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those. Okay, I mean, a little bit less good of a payoff as the other gold cards we've seen, but still extremely beneficial because if you have the things to be regurgitating from your hand, the card is great. I will say that the expend 4 ability is relatively lackluster. Maybe they found that it was important because other decks were more aggressive. We'll just have to see. But I think with the mana generation, as long as you have resources in hand to be able to trigger expend 4, which I don't know how consistently you're able to like do that at this point in the game, then, I mean, you just have to use the final ability 1 time for this to be worth it. So I think this is just a build around B-. It might end up being a little bit worse than it seems on paper, just because you have to have a lot of things go right for you, but the payoff potential is there. Next up, we have Vren, the Restless. Next up, we have Vren, the Relentless. This is 2, a blue and a black for a 3/4 legendary rat. This has Ward 2. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. At the beginning of each end step, create X 1/1 rats with this creature gets +1/+1 for each other rat you control, where X is the number of creatures your opponent controlled that were exiled this turn. Wow. So if you're able to just like kill 3 of your opponent's creatures during the end step, you're going to get 3 1/1s that get +1/+1 for each other rat you control. So they're going to be 4/4s? Wow, that's absurd. This card can get out of hand very easily. But you do have to do things with your opponent's cards. Let's go build around B. Let's go build around beat. It does have word 2, which I'm a big fan of, so you get additional time to potentially get this rolling. So I do like that aspect, and I think it's fairly statted. Next up, we have Zoraline Cosmo Caller. This is a 3/3 legendary bat with flying and vigilance. Whenever a bat you control attacks, gain 1 life. Okay, I'm already in. When this enters or attacks, you can pay a white and a black and gain 2 life. Whenever you do, return target non-land permanent with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Once again, we get another effect that revives from the graveyard without coming into play tapped. I'm so in on this. Even without that bottom text, I'd be in. 3 mana 3/3 flying vigilance, and my bats get to give me life inherently, which triggers all my other synergies. That's already insane. And then the ability to just immediately revive something, that's also insane. Like, I think this is a build around B+. There's so many build around B+ in this set. Next up, we have Glarb, Calamity's Augur. Green, a black, and a blue for a legendary frog that is 2/4 Death Touch. Look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play lands and cast spells with mana value 4 or greater from the top. You may tap this to surveil too. So at first glance, it seems like this isn't realistic, but from what I've been told from other people is that Sultai is the primary color combination that you are most likely going to be able to go into 3 colors, which makes me think this is probably a better card than it looks, but still just having to get 3 mana of different colors is kind of like difficult because, you know, being able to play lands from the top is kind of a thing that's more beneficial when you don't have all 3 of your sources, which tells me this might not play as good as it is. I don't think this makes me want to go Sultai. I think it is a good card to pick up in Sultai, and therefore I'm going C+. Next up, we have Helga Skittish Seer, a green, a white, and a blue for a 1/3 legendary frog. When you cast a creature spell with mana value 4 or greater, you may draw a card, gain 1 life, and put a 1/1 counter on this creature. Tap to add X mana of any color, where X is this creature's power. Spend this only to cast creatures with mana value 4 or greater, or creatures with X in their mana cost. This one doesn't seem realistic. I don't think you really want to go Bant, nor does this make me want to move into Bant. It doesn't seem realistic. If it's realistic to actually play Bant, card seems fine. I don't think it seems great by any means. I feel like there's just not a lot of reasons for me to be meshing green and blue with white, in my opinion. Like, I feel like those are kind of different. Like, obviously with this card, you're trying to be primarily green-blue, so you have later game things to put out. I just don't know that there's much more things I want to be splashing in white, and I feel like this card's not going to pan out. So I'm just going to go with the C-. Next up, we have Hugs. Aw, Hugs. Grizzly Guardian. He is 2 green, 2 red, and X. For a legendary badger. Don't fuck with the honey badger, boys. He is 5/5 trample. When he enters, exile the top cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. So, realistically, I don't know that you're going to be able to put out Hugs for more than 6 mana at the most. And with that framework in mind, I feel like Hugs is okay. He could allow you to expend 8, which could be fine. Maybe that's the purpose of this card, but it just seems like mainly a constructed card. I'm just going to go with a C. I think there's utility behind this card, but it's not a reason for me to want to move into this color combination. And it's also like, I kind of want to know what my deck's looking like before I want to put this in at all. Because you have to be really set up to be generating a bunch of mana, have a lot of dorks, and a lot of the good dorks seem to be rare and above. Next up, we have Roll Crackling Wit. This is the only Planeswalker in the set. It is 2, a blue, and a red for a Raw that looks like a otter. When you cast a non-creature spell, put a loyalty counter on Raw. He has 4 starting loyalty. +1, create a 1/1 prowess token. -3, draw 3, discard 2. -10, draw 3, you get an emblem. Instants and sorceries have Storm. I mean, it's a planeswalker that has decent value generation. It's just an easy A. Now, I'm going to go A+. The one planeswalker in each format tends to be pretty oppressive, and especially this one, it's made for the one archetype that is the most control-oriented and gives that archetype the biggest bonus, which makes me feel like this card is just absurd in that deck. It's kind of just like a win more card in that deck. Like, yeah, like you might even be willing to just splash this if you're one of the 2 colors. As long as you're not aggressive, this card's insane and probably going to be the best value engine in the set. So I'm going Synergy A+. Next up, we have the infamous Cruel Claw. This is 1 a black and a red for a legendary weasel with menace. It is 3/3. Whenever this deals damage to a player, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land. You may cast the card by discarding a card rather than paying its mana cost. Red-black is already aggressive. That's good. I'm getting a 3/3 menace. That's good. I get to trigger my opponent losing life. That's good. So I can discard a card to shoot out another guy. I mean, this just seems like all the things that I'm looking to do within the red-black space. Now, you may not always have a card to discard, but it's just still good on its own. Like, at worst, it's a 3/3 menace, which I feel like the deck is moderately to high, like, relatively interested in. No one else is really interested in it. I think it's probably, like, build around B-. Good card. If you get to get it off one time, you're probably, like, extremely ahead, but it's also like it's probably not living very long, and like in the deck where you're going to be using this might be the lowest costed average CMC deck in the game, which means it might not be as insane as you would think, but I mean, if you hit something good, it's just game ending. So yeah, probably just a build around B-. Our last gold card here is Yagra, Eater of All. It is 3 a black and a green for a legendary elemental, and it is 6/6 with ward, sack a food. Other creatures are food artifacts in addition to their other types, and have pay 2 to sacrifice this permanent, and you get, okay, they have the food text. So other creatures are food, and they have the ability to sacrifice them same as a food. When a food is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put 2 1/1 counters on Yagra, Eater of All. Wow, I kind of wish this card was in Wilds of Eldraine, because it would have went with the flavor, and it would have been really cool. So, 5 mana, 6/6, ward, sack a food. That's cool. I don't like that I'm enabling my opponent to be able to pay the word cost, but I guess that's fine. When anything dies, I put 2 1/1s on this. That seems really good as well. Yeah, I think this card's actually, like, way better. Like, it was hard for me to, like, sell it to myself because my opponent is getting ward fodder. But I guess that's fine, right? Like, so they pay the ward cost, which means that whatever they want to do to kill this, if they have that one card that says deal 6 damage to it, it's the red card, and then you get to deal 2 to something else, I'm pretty sure. This gets the 2 1/1 counters before their effect resolves, and then it doesn't die. So I guess that's kind of a cool synergy with this card. I think it's an okay card. I'm going to go build around B. Now I'm going to go build around B-. I think it's just like, it's a big guy. That's cool. If you have a lot of things to be doing with food, that's really cool. Yeah, so I'm going to go build around B-. I think it's cool if you're like set up for it, but you do have to do quite a bit of work to make it situated, and it is pretty high costed. All right, that's going to do it for the gold. That's going to do it for the multicolored rares and mythics. We are now going to move on to the colorless cards. Hold on. Technical difficulties. We are pulling up the cards, and this is going to round off the video. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the lands as well. And then I finally get to allow myself to eat, which is cool. All right, stay with me, friends. We are almost to the end. So first up in the artifact section, we have Bark Form Harvester. This is 3 mana for a 2/3 with Changeling, so it's every creature type, and it has reach. 2 mana, put target creature card, or put target card from your graveyard in the bottom of your library. I feel like that's not really that relevant. Not really interested in the stat line, and also this is even less valuable because everything already has reach. So I'm going to put this at D-. Next up, we have Bumbleflower Sharepot. This is 2, and whenever it enters, create a food. And then for 5 and sack this, destroy target non-land permanent. I think this is probably like a D level card. Maybe a D+ in the green-black food deck. Or forage deck, whatever you want to call it. And everywhere else, you just don't want to play it. It's just paying 5 mana is so bad. And I don't think if you're not like super addicted to foods in your deck, like super consumed by it, that this means anything to you at all. We've seen similar effects like this that have just been asked. So probably like D to D+ in your dedicated forage deck and just F everywhere else. Next up, we have Fountain Port Bell. This is 1, and whenever it enters, search your library for a basic land, put it on top of your library. And then 1, sack this, draw a card. I don't think you ever really want to play this. It's really bad. Like, you're paying 1 mana to not even immediately draw a basic land. I'm paying 2 mana to just essentially add a basic land to my hand, or wait till next turn, and then draw a card for 1 later on, which just seems terrible. Maybe if you have like an absurd bomb and you're in the Sultai colors, you might play it. I'm going to go D- here. Next, we have Heirloom Epic. This is 1, and you can pay 4 and tap it to draw a card. For each mana in this ability's activation, you may tap an untapped creature you control rather than pay that mana. Activate only as a sorcery. So I think this is most relevant in the green-white tokens deck, which then you can start turning your tokens into a draw card, which might break you in a stalemate. But overall, it's pretty bad. Like, the raid is really bad, but it's a really fun card too. I'll go D+. It's an okay card. I mean, you know, you might play it if you're low unplayable. It's not terrible, as long as your deck's situated. Next up, we have Patchwork Banner. This is 3, and when it enters, you choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, and then you tap it for a mana rock. I think this is okay. I think in like a go wide lizard strategy, or a go wide red-white mice deck, or even a green-white rabbits deck, any of those 3 archetypes, it's probably a C- to D+ card. Just because the Anthem effect is nice. Maybe if you're playing Sultai and you have a bomb, you might put this into Splash, but I think it's more likely the aggro decks. Next up, we have Shortbow. This is 2, equipped creature, gets +1/+1, and has Vigilance and Reach. and you can equip for 1. I wouldn't say this would be garbage if it wasn't for the fact that everything in the set already has reach, which really devalues this card. If you're low on playables in red-white, maybe you'll play it as a Valiant trigger. It is a 1 equip Valiant trigger, which might be okay. I'm going to go D-. Next up, we have Starforged Sword. This is 4 for another equipment. When it enters, if you gift your opponent a tapped fish, you can attach it without paying the equip cost. And then equipped creature gets +3/+3, loses flying. And the equip cost is 3. This is a really sad card because the picture is really cool. But the card is ass. Yeah, this card is just really bad. I guess you're giving your opponent the fish tapped, which is kind of okay. There is some versatility to where I guess you can put it on... No, you can't put it on your opponent's thing. I thought you could. But it says attach it to target creature you control, which makes it really, really bad. Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't have been that much better if you could equip it to your opponent's creature, but there would be at least some relevance where you make their creature lose flying, even though it's buffed. I think this is just an F. I don't think you ever want to play this. Like, you can trigger your Valiant, but I'd rather play that thing that equips for 1 if I'm doing that. Next up, we have Tangle Tumbler. 3 for a vehicle, 6/6 Vigilance. 3 in tap, put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. Tap 2 untapped tokens. This becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. Okay. You might be able to sell me on this in the green-white deck. You might actually be able to sell me on this. Because the threat of activation is there. You don't have to. It's the fact that you can tap 2 tokens during your opponent's turn, and you're just threatening a 6/6 blocker. And then if they don't attack because of the threat of activation, during the end step, you could start putting 1/1 counters on things, which leads me to believe this could be okay as a 1-of in that deck. I'm going to go C- because I do think there is that implication. Next up, we have 3 Tree Mascot. This is 2 for another artifact creature with Changeling. It's a 2/1, and you can pay 1 mana to add 1 mana of any color. Activate only once each turn. This would probably be slightly better if the format was more oriented to reward you for going 3 colors, but it's really not. If you're in the Sultai space, you could convince me this is fine. I'm going to go D, because it is playable, but only Sultai would be even remotely interested. And the once per turn thing is just really, really stupid. All right, moving on to our lands here, we have Fabled Passage, an OG return from original Eldraine. Sack this and put a basic land card on the battlefield tapped, but if you have 4 or more lands, untap it. I mean, this is probably just the best form of land fixing in the entire format. Your Sultai decks are going to want it. Your decks with bombs are going to want it. I think this is just a solid B-. This is a good card. Now, the amount of, the level at which you want to pick this is going to depend on, what you're trying to do. If you're playing red-white aggro, you're not going to want this. It's not even a B to you. It's just unusable, right? But to the Sultai deck that enables a bomb, it's a B. Yeah, it's just good. Next up, we have our new land, which is Fountainport. Tap for a colorless. 2 in tap, sack a token, draw a card. 3 in tap, pay 1 life, create a 1/1 fish token that is not tapped. And then 4 in tap, create a treasure. I think, to be honest with you, the decks that want this most are just going to be the Threshold deck. The Threshold deck likes this a lot. It's a value engine. Green-blue could be interested in this because it's a value engine. Maybe even red-blue. I mean, ultimately, if your mana base is good, this is just a B-level card because it's free, right? If it doesn't affect your mana base and you get this for free, I mean, just the potential to be able to have one of these late game value oriented effects is just something you'd rather have than not. So I'm just going to go B-. Next up, we have Hidden Grotto, which is our land at common. When this enters, you can surveil 1, tap it for a colorless, 1 and tap it, add 1 mana of any color. This is going to be the main culprit that will actually enable you to splash bombs, actually enable you to play Sultai. And if you're trying to do those things, this is probably in relative, like, decent priority for you. Especially, like, it doesn't enter tapped, which is just good. So, I'm going to give this C+ in the right space. Not playing this if you're going aggro or you can't afford to. You know, the threshold decks probably do pretty... The threshold decks probably want this regardless because the surveil is just worth it. So I actually really like this play on Crystal Grotto. I'm going to give it a C+ in those decks. And outside of it, you don't really want it. Maybe it's just a C. I'll just go C. Next up, we have our cycle of uncommon lands for each color. Lilypad Village taps for a colorless, or tap to add a blue, but you can only cast a creature spell with it. That's what they all do. You can pay a blue and tap it to surveil 2. Activate only if a bird, frog, otter, or rat entered under your control this turn. Obviously, the threshold decks will really like this. Any deck that already has a good mana base, you just throw these in. I'm going to value them at C. Some are better than others, but I think this one is a C. I think it's especially good in the threshold deck. Just because it can enable that, like, very quickly. Surveilling 2 for 1 blue, not losing your card, great. Next up, we have Lupin Flower Village. Tap it for a colorless, tap it for a white, only for creatures. You can pay 1 and a white and tap it, sacrifice it, look at the top 6. You may reveal a bat, bird, mouse, or rabbit from among them, put it into your hand, rest on the bottom. Yeah, I think I'm down for this. Yeah, I'm down for this as a C as well. I mean, this is very similar to the lands in Lost Caverns. They were all pretty much C's, but when you got into simplified game states, if you could afford to play the tapped land, you were more happy that you had them and not, because the ability to Cascade 5 won you a decent amount of games if your opponent didn't value them like you did. Now, these are an uncommon, but they do provide you a colorless mana source at minimum and do not come into play tapped, which is very nice. So I think this one's a C as well. Aggro decks will like this as a way to get more gas in late game. Next up, we have Mudflap Village. This one, you can pay 1 and a black, sack it. Return target bat, lizard, rat, or squirrel from your graveyard to your hand. That's okay. Yeah, I'm down with another C. This one's fine as well. So far, they've all been like very equally balanced. This one, more so, I'm interested in the Squirrels deck. Threshold. I mean, I guess it doesn't... I guess this might be one of the better forms of recursion with Threshold. It replaces itself in the graveyard, so you add back a bomb. Don't lose Threshold if you already had it at exactly 7, because it puts a card in the grave, so that's cool. Next up, we have Oak Hollow Village. This one, you can pay a green and tap it. Put a 1/1 counter on each frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel you control that enter the battlefield this turn. That's probably really good in the rabbit space, mid in the frog space, and the raccoon space also like mid. Yeah, I mean, I think this is mainly a rabbit card. You play that 3-mana white spell that gives you 3 1/1 tokens for 3, and then you just give a 1/1 counter to all of them for 1. Sign me up. That's cool. I think I'm going to give this one a C- because I think it's more segmented in its use. And then we have Rockface Village, which honestly is the coolest one from an art perspective. Pay 1 and tap. Target lizard, mouse, otter, or raccoon gets +1/+0 and gains haste. So this can target your Valiant effects, which makes this one probably more interesting than the others. And I mean, it's 2 to give someone haste. That's cool. I'm going to give this one C+, just because I highly regard Valiant, and getting a free way to keep triggering Valiant every turn without losing a card seems absurd, and the artwork is just based. So I'm going to give this one C+, probably the one I hold in the highest regard. And then we have 3 Tree City. This one's a rare legendary land. As it enters, you choose a creature type. It can tap for a colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it, choose a color, add an amount of mana of that color, equal to the number of creatures you control of that chosen type. So, I've heard some people say this before. In Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we had Cavern of Souls. That was a card that was okay, and typically you played it if you had like 12 to 13 creatures of that given type. I think the same could be said here. If you have like, upwards of close to like 15 creatures of the same type, throw it in. If not, you're not interested. Some decks will be more interested than others, like the aggro decks, you don't really care as much. The decks where you're cheating out big boys, okay. Green white will be fine with it, because they do have like the 5 mana guy who creates tokens, so it's like a card you might want to cheat out. But you're also like equally decent chance to have enough guys to get a mana advantage from this. So I'm going to give this C. And then our final one here is a land common, which is Uncharted Haven. As this enters, it enters tapped, and as it enters, you can choose a color, add 1 mana of the chosen color. Might just be the best form of fixing it common in the entire set. This is probably going to be the one that most easily allows you to be splashing bombs, most easily allows you to enable a Sultai deck. Although I do think the Surveil in the grotto with the grotto is probably slightly better for the Threshold deck, which might be the deck that is going Sultai. So I think this is just a C. It's just good. If you can afford to have a tapped land, you're down. If you're playing aggro, you can't afford that, you're not interested. So it's just a C. But that is going to wrap it up for our limited set review for Burrow, which will be coming out, I believe, on MTG Arena Tuesday, July 30th. So that is going to be very exciting. I hope you guys were able to gain some insight from this. I'm going to be working on a tier list at some point that I will eventually share in the Discord. So make sure you stay tuned for that. And if you guys want to see some Burrow content, maybe some early drafts, some early decks, make sure to smash the like button, turn post notifications on, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another banger. Now, I really want to thank everybody who took the time to actually get this far, because I know this was a very long one, and anybody who has caught up the full series on this set review, I really enjoy these, although I know they aren't like really lucrative and most people aren't going to watch that long. I just like providing competitive insight on an analytical level. So hopefully you gain something from this, and hopefully you are at least somewhat excited about something in this format. Let me know down below what you are most interested in from Burrow. Is it the commander cards? Are you a little bit of a weirdo for that? Or what archetype are you most interested in trying to draft from this format? Make sure to let me know down below in the comments. And as always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.